Naomi Hale stepped off the train and heard the laughter start before her boots touched the platform. She did not turn around. She did not cry. She lifted her chin and said the only thing left to say to a world that had judged her, "I'm here to be a wife, not a decoration." By supper that night, every hungry hand on the ranch was fighting over the last biscuit in her pan. If you want to see how the plain bride became the one thing that ranch couldn't live without, hit subscribe and stay to the end. Drop your city in the comments below. Nobody in Miller's Bend had asked Naomi Hale if she wanted to be laughed at. They just did it anyway. The train had barely stopped rolling before the whispering started on the platform. A cluster of women in ironed bonnets pressed their heads together, eyes crawling over her plain brown dress, her broad shoulders the extra weight she carried on her hips and had long since stopped apologizing for. That's her. That's the bride. Lord have mercy, Caleb Whitmore could have asked for anyone. Guess beggars can't be choosers out here. Naomi heard every word. She always heard every word. She had spent 11 years learning how to walk through a room like the words weren't landing, and she used that same walk now, stepping off the train with her spine straight and her suitcase gripped in both hands like it was the only thing left of her old life worth holding on to. A tall man stood apart from the crowd, hat in his hands instead of on his head, watching her with an expression she couldn't read yet. Caleb Whitmore didn't look surprised. He didn't look disappointed either. He just looked like a man doing math in his head and coming up with an answer he intended to keep to himself. "Miss Hale?" he asked. "Mrs. Whitmore in about an hour, I believe," she said. "Unless you've changed your mind since your last letter." Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile. "I don't recall writing anything I didn't mean." Behind them, the whispering hadn't stopped. Poor man. Guess he really was desperate for a housekeeper. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't turn around. He picked up her suitcase before she could stop him and said low enough that only she could hear, "Preacher's waiting. You still want to do this? Or you want to get back on that train?" Naomi looked at the town, at the women who'd already decided everything about her before she said a single word to any of them. At the storefronts, the dust, the hard blue sky over a life she'd crossed 3 states to reach. "I didn't come this far to leave empty-handed," she said. "Let's go get married, Mr. Whitmore." The ceremony took 11 minutes. Naomi counted them the way she counted most hard things, because counting kept her hands from shaking. The preacher's wife stood as witness, with a face like she'd bitten into something sour. 2 ranch hands leaned in the doorway of the little church arms, crossed, clearly sent by someone to report back on what the new Mrs. Whitmore looked like up close. "She's got a strong back on her at least," one of them muttered to the other. "Good for hauling water, I reckon." Naomi didn't flinch. She'd trained herself not to the same way she'd trained herself to knead dough for 20 minutes straight, without her arms giving out the same way she'd trained herself to smile at customers who called her big and plain to her face like it was a compliment they were doing her the favor of saying out loud. When the preacher pronounced them married, Caleb didn't kiss her. He just held out his arm, formal as a business deal, and said, "Ranch is a half-hour out. You hungry?" "Starving," Naomi admitted. "Didn't eat since yesterday morning. Didn't want to spend money I might need." Something in his face shifted again. Softer this time. "We'll fix that." The wagon ride out was quiet, except for the creak of wheels and the occasional word from Caleb about the land they passed, whose fence that was where the creek bent, how far it still was to the house. Naomi watched him more than she watched the scenery. He had the kind of face that didn't waste expressions. Everything he felt seemed to cost him something to show, so he mostly didn't show it, and she respected that more than she expected to. "Your letters didn't say much about yourself," she said finally. "Just the ranch, just the work." "Didn't figure you needed poetry. Figured you needed to know what you were walking into." "And what am I walking into?" He was quiet for a moment. "A ranch that's barely holding together. 4 hired hands who've had nobody cooking for them but themselves for 2 years since my mother passed. A house that needs a woman's hand in it. Bad, and not because I think a woman belongs cooking and cleaning, because I don't have the first idea how to keep any of it running right, and I'm tired of watching good men eat burnt beans because I can't do better. Naomi almost laughed. That's the most honest thing anybody said to me in a year. I don't have time to be anything but honest. Ranch doesn't leave room for it. They came over a rise, and the ranch spread out below them, a low house, a bigger barn corrals, and 4 men who stopped what they were doing the second the wagon came into view. Naomi felt their eyes on her the way she'd felt every pair of eyes since she'd stepped off that train, sizing her up, already forming their opinions. A younger one, maybe 16, whispered something to the older man beside him. The older man, broad-shouldered, gray at the temples, didn't bother whispering back. "That her?" he said loud enough to carry. "Caleb, you sure you didn't get swindled? Fella selling you a bride ought to at least send a picture that matches." The heat crawled up Naomi's neck before she could stop it. She kept her eyes forward, but her hands folded in her lap had gone white-knuckled again. Caleb's voice, when it came, was flat and hard as a shut door. "Silas, that's my wife you're talking about." "Didn't mean nothing by it, boss." "Sounded like you meant plenty." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Naomi had heard all day. Silas looked at his boots. The younger boy, Tobias, she would learn later, looked like he wanted to disappear into the ground. The third hand, a heavy-set older man named Otis, at least had the decency to tip his hat. "Ma'am," Otis said, "welcome to the ranch." "Thank you," Naomi said, and meant it because it was the first kind word anyone in this town had offered her since she'd arrived. Caleb helped her down from the wagon, his hand steady under her elbow, not lingering, not awkward, just there when she needed it, and carried her suitcase toward the house himself, leaving the hands standing in the yard with their unfinished chores and their unfinished apologies. Inside the house told its own story before anyone said a word. Dust on every surface. A stove crusted with the residue of meals cooked without care. A larder with flour, salt, pork, dried beans, and not much else. It was the kitchen of men who ate to survive, not to live. "I know it ain't much," Caleb said, standing in the doorway like a man bracing for judgment. Naomi set her suitcase down and looked around the room slowly, the way she looked at everything, cataloging, assessing, already 3 steps ahead in her mind. "It's got good bones. Stove solid even if it's filthy. Window gets afternoon light, which means I can proof bread by it in winter. This will do just fine." "You don't have to pretend it's fine." "I'm not pretending." She rolled up her sleeves, already surveying the shelves like a general surveying a battlefield. "I've cooked in worse. Boarding house kitchen I worked in Kansas City had a stove that caught fire twice a month, and a landlord who docked my pay both times for the smoke damage. This is a palace by comparison." For the first time since the train platform, Caleb Whitmore almost smiled. "Well, supper's usually whatever Otis throws in a pot. Hope you weren't expecting much tonight." "Give me 2 hours and that stove," Naomi said, "and I'll show you what expecting much looks like." He studied her for a long moment, like he was recalculating something. 2 hours. All right, Mrs. Whitmore, we'll hold you to it. She worked like a woman who'd spent her whole life being told her only value was in her hands, and had decided a long time ago to make those hands worth more than anyone's insults. She scrubbed the stove first, because a dirty stove lied to you about its heat. She sent Tobias, the boy sent in to watch her. She suspected more than to help her, running to the smokehouse and the root cellar calling out what she needed, like she'd worked this land her whole life instead of arriving on it 2 hours ago. "Bacon fat if you've got it saved. Onions however many you've got, I don't care if they're sprouting. Anything green in that garden patch I saw, even if it's gone half to weed." Tobias ran. He came back with his arms, full cheeks red from more than just the heat. "You always order folks around like that, ma'am. Only when I'm cooking. Rest of the time, I'm perfectly agreeable." She was already dicing onions with a speed that made the boy's eyes widen. "Now hush and hand me that skillet before it stops being hot enough to matter." By the time the sun started dropping toward the barn roof, the smell coming out of that kitchen had done something to the ranch that no amount of talking ever could. Silas, out mending fence 100 yards off, stopped his hammer mid-swing and lifted his head like a hound catching a scent. "That smell what I think it is." Otis, beside him, had already set down his own tools. "Smells like somebody in that kitchen knows what they're doing." Smells like biscuits? Tobias called from the porch, grinning wide enough to show the gap in his teeth. And bacon gravy. And I think there's a pie. A pie? Silas straightened up so fast he nearly dropped his hammer. There ain't been pie on this ranch since Caleb's mama passed. They came in one by one, drawn by their noses more than any invitation, and every single one of them stopped in the kitchen doorway, the same way mouths half-open eyes on the table Naomi had set with more food than that ranch had likely seen in a single sitting in 2 years. Fried chicken, golden and crackling. A pot of greens cooked down with bacon fat and a splash of vinegar that cut through the richness. Biscuits stacked high enough to topple split open and steaming. And at the center of it all, a peach pie crust browned to perfection, the filling still bubbling faintly at the seams. Lord above, Otis said quietly. Silas didn't say anything at all. He just sat down slow like a man approaching something he wasn't sure he was allowed to touch. Well, sit, Naomi said, wiping her hands on her apron, refusing to let herself enjoy their shock as much as she wanted to. Food doesn't stay hot out of spite. Caleb came in last, and the look on his face when he saw the table stopped him dead in the doorway. He looked at the spread, then at Naomi, then back at the spread, like he was trying to reconcile the woman who'd told him 2 hours ago that a filthy stove was fine with the meal now steaming in front of him. You did all this, he said. Not quite a question. Told you to give me 2 hours. Naomi took her seat, folding her hands in her lap, the same way she had on the train platform, the same steady posture that had carried her through every insult that day. Well, are you all going to stare at it, or are you going to eat? Nobody needed telling twice. The silence that followed wasn't the ugly silence from the church doorway or the wagon ride. This silence had forks scraping plates and biscuits disappearing 2 at a time, and Otis making a sound low in his throat like he might actually weep into his gravy. Tobias ate like he hadn't eaten in a week, and maybe by ranch standards, he hadn't not real food, not food made by somebody who cared whether it tasted like something. Silas was the one who finally spoke, mouth still half full, staring down at his plate like it had personally wronged him. Ma'am, he said, I believe I owe you an apology. You believe correctly? Naomi said, without looking up from her own plate. I said something ugly back there in the yard. Wasn't right of me. No, it wasn't. He waited like he expected her to let him off easier than that. She didn't. She just kept eating calm as still water and let the silence sit there until he understood that an apology didn't erase what it followed. It just started the work of making up for it. This chicken, he finally said, clearing his throat, might be the best thing I've eaten in my whole life. And I mean that as an apology and as the plain truth both at once. Otis nodded so hard his hat nearly fell off. Boy, hush and let the woman eat. You can grovel after she's had her pie. That got a laugh out of the table, the first real easy laugh Naomi had heard since stepping off that train, and something in her chest loosened just slightly. Some knot she hadn't realized she'd been carrying since the platform. Tobias, still chewing, looked at her with the kind of open curiosity only a 16-year-old could manage without shame. Where'd you learn to cook like this, ma'am? Ain't nobody taught themselves this good. Naomi set down her fork, and for a moment the table went quiet, waiting. My mother taught me some of it. Rest I learned the hard way working boarding house kitchens since I was 14. When you're a girl, nobody's rushing to marry off. You learn early that you'd best make yourself useful some other way, or you don't eat. That ain't right, Tobias said, frowning, like the injustice of it personally offended him. Woman who can cook like this ought to have men lined up at her door. Men don't line up for a woman my size, Tobias, Naomi said, plain as she said everything else, no bitterness in it, just fact. They line up for the ones the magazines put on the cover. I made my peace with that a long time ago. Decided if nobody wanted to look at me, I'd make sure they couldn't stop thinking about my cooking instead. Well, they're sure not going to stop now, Otis said, reaching for one more biscuit, despite his plate already looking like a battlefield. I'll tell you that for free. Silas, still working through the last of his own plate, glanced up at her with something that looked almost like respect, settling into the shame still sitting on his face. For what it's worth, ma'am. I don't know what fool wrote that first letter you got from us describing what kind of wife Caleb was after. But whatever it said, it didn't say enough. It said he needed somebody who could cook, keep house, and wasn't afraid of hard work, Naomi said. Didn't say a word about how I looked. That's the letter I answered. Good thing, too, Otis muttered, or we'd all still be eating burnt beans. Caleb at the head of the table hadn't said much through the exchange, but Naomi caught him watching her again, that same unreadable expression from the train platform, except softer now, worn down at the edges by 4 men, laughing around a table that had been silent for 2 years. Not the careful calculating look from the wagon ride, something warmer. Something that looked almost like relief. I told you, he said quietly, just to her, the ranch needed a woman's hand. You said you needed somebody who could cook better than burnt beans, Naomi said. You didn't say anything about needing somebody who'd make grown men cry over gravy. Didn't know I needed that until just now. After supper, after the plates were cleared and the last of the pie had vanished, Tobias had gone back for a 3rd slice with the shameless persistence of a boy who knew nobody would stop him. The hands drifted back out to the bunkhouse, still talking about the meal, like men who'd witnessed something close to a miracle. Naomi stood at the wash basin, scrubbing plates, and Caleb, instead of leaving her to it the way she half expected, picked up a rag and started drying. You don't have to do that, she said. Didn't say I had to. Said I would. They worked in comfortable quiet for a while, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling, and Naomi found herself studying him the way she had on the wagon ride, trying to read a man who didn't waste expressions, who said exactly as much as he meant, and not a word more. Can I ask you something? She said finally. Go on. Why me? You could have written to any agency, any woman. Why answer a letter from somebody who told you plain, in the very first line, that she wasn't a beauty and didn't intend to pretend otherwise? Caleb set down the plate he was drying, slow and careful, like he was choosing his next words with the same care. Because every other letter I got read like a woman selling herself, like she thought I wanted a china doll to set on a shelf. Yours was the only one that read like a woman telling me the truth, because she respected me enough not to waste my time with anything else. Naomi didn't have an answer for that. Not right away. Man spent his whole life around cattle and dirt and hard weather, Caleb went on. Learns real quick what's true and what's just pretty talk. Your letter was true. Figured the woman who wrote it probably was too. And now that you've met me, now I've met you, he said, and I'm starting to think I got the better end of a deal I didn't even know I was making. Something about the plainness of it, no flourish, no performance. Just a tired rancher telling the truth, the same way he always seemed to hit Naomi harder than any flowery compliment ever had. She turned back to the wash basin so he wouldn't see her face, but she was smiling, and she let herself have that, at least in the privacy of a kitchen that was already starting to feel less like a stranger's house. It didn't last. The knock at the door came just as she was hanging up the last of the dish towels, sharp and impatient, in a way that made Caleb's whole body go still before he'd even crossed the room to answer it. The man standing on the porch wore a suit too fine for a ranch visit and a smile too thin to mean anything good. He was maybe 50, silver-haired, with the soft hands of a man who'd never once had to work land himself, and eyes that moved past Caleb, immediately landing on Naomi, with an appraisal so cold it made her skin crawl. Evening, Caleb, the man said. Heard congratulations were in order. Grady. Caleb's voice had gone flat again, that same shut-door tone from the wagon ride, except colder now. Bit late for a social call. Wasn't exactly social. Grady Pruitt's eyes drifted past Caleb again, toward the kitchen, toward the lingering smell of fried chicken and peach pie that still hung warm in the air. He inhaled, slow and deliberate, and something ugly flickered behind his polite smile. Smells like your new bride's already making herself useful. She's my wife, not hired help. Of course, of course. Pruitt's smile didn't move, but something in his eyes went sharper. Just came to remind you, friendly as I can, that the note on this ranch comes due at the end of summer. Bank's not in the business of extending kindness twice, Caleb. You understand my meaning. Naomi standing just inside the kitchen doorway where she could hear every word. felt the floor shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with the house itself. A note, a debt. A deadline hanging over this ranch that Caleb hadn't said one single word about. Not on the train platform, not on the wagon ride, not across a table piled with fried chicken while 4 hungry men called her a miracle. "I understand it fine," Caleb said. "You'll have your payment. See that I do." Pruitt tipped his hat finally, an empty gesture that felt more like a threat than a courtesy. His eyes found Naomi one last time before he turned to go, and his voice dropped just slightly, just enough that she knew the words were meant for her as much as for Caleb. "Welcome to Miller's Bend, Mrs. Whitmore. Hope you brought more to this marriage than a good hand with a skillet. Caleb's going to need it." He walked off into the dark, toward a fine black horse tied at the gate, and Caleb stood in the doorway a long moment after the hoofbeats faded, jaw-tight shoulders squared, like a man bracing for a blow he'd known was coming for a long time. Naomi came up beside him slowly. "What note?" Naomi. "What note, Caleb?" He didn't answer right away, and in that silence, in the space where an honest man usually filled the quiet with the truth, Naomi felt something cold settle low in her stomach, the same feeling she'd carried onto that train 3 states back, the feeling of being brought somewhere for reasons nobody had bothered to tell her yet. "There's things about this ranch," Caleb said finally. "I should have told you before you said yes at that church." Naomi stood very still, waiting the warmth of the evening, the supper, the laughter, the quiet moment at the wash basin, all of it going cold and distant behind the sudden sinking certainty that her wedding day wasn't nearly finished handing her surprises. "Then tell me now," she said, "because I didn't come 3 states and marry a stranger to find out the truth secondhand from a man in a fancy suit smiling at me like I was something he already owned." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, Naomi saw something in his face she hadn't seen yet. Fear. "The note Pruitt's talking about," Caleb said, "isn't new. My father took it out 4 years back when the drought killed half the herd and we needed seed money to keep the rest of the land producing. Pruitt's bank held it. Still holds it. Payments due at the end of summer, same as he said, and if I don't have the full amount, he takes the ranch." Naomi stood very still, letting the words settle the way she let hard truths settle slow and complete before she let herself react to any single piece of them. "How much is owed?" "More than I've got sitting anywhere close to hand. Cattle prices dropped this spring. I've been selling what I can, saving every dollar, but it isn't enough. Wasn't enough before you got here, and it still isn't enough now." "Then why didn't you tell me in your letters? On the platform? On the wagon ride out here while you were telling me about fence lines and creek bends like that? Mattered more than the fact that I might be marrying into a ranch you're about to lose." Caleb's jaw worked, and for the first time since she'd met him, Naomi watched him struggle to find honest words instead of simply reaching for them. "Because I was ashamed of it, and because—" He stopped. "Because what?" "Because a man asking a woman to marry him under a roof he might not keep past October isn't much of a proposal. Figured if I told you straight out, you'd have every right to get back on that train." "I had every right to know," Naomi said. "Whether I stayed was never going to be about the roof, Caleb. It was going to be about whether the man standing under it told me the truth." The silence between them stretched long enough that the lamp on the table burned lower before either of them spoke again. "There's more," Caleb said finally. Naomi's stomach tightened. "More. Pruitt didn't just come here to remind me about the note. Man doesn't ride out this late for a reminder he could have sent by letter. He came to see you. To see the woman I married size her up, decide for himself whether I've got a fighting chance at holding this land or whether I've already lost it and just don't know it yet." Caleb ran a hand through his hair, and for a moment he looked younger than she'd taken him for. Tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "He's been trying to buy this ranch outright for 2 years. Offered half what it's worth the first time, insulted me to my face doing it. When I said no, he started calling in favors at the bank, tightening terms, making sure nothing about that loan would ever be easy for me to pay off clean. Why does he want it so badly? It's grazing land. Cattle and dirt, same as every other spread out here." There's talk of a rail spur coming through the valley in a year, maybe two. Whoever owns this land when that spur gets built stands to make more money selling parcels to the railroad than they'd make in 10 years of cattle. Pruitt's known about it longer than most. I only found out myself this spring from a surveyor who'd had too much whiskey in town and talked more than he should have. Naomi absorbed that too, filing it away with the same careful precision she filed away every hard thing. So this isn't about a debt he's owed. This is about land he wants. It's both, but mostly yes. It's about the land. And he'll use the debt to take it since he can't buy it outright. That's the whole of it. Naomi turned away from him toward the window, toward the dark shape of the barn, against a sky gone the color of a bruise. She thought of the 11 minutes it had taken to marry him, the 2 hours it had taken to cook a supper that had made grown men nearly weep, the whole long day of insults and small kindnesses that had brought her to this exact kitchen standing across from a man who had let her walk into a war without telling her there was a war at all. "I need you to understand something," she said, still facing the window. "I've been laughed at my whole life for how I look. I made my peace with that a long time ago, same as I told your men at supper. But I have never once in 31 years let a man make decisions about my life without telling me the truth first. Not my father. Not the men who wrote to that agency looking for a wife, and then wrote back once they saw a photograph of me and decided plain wasn't worth the postage to reply. Not anyone." She turned back to face him. "You're going to tell me everything, Caleb. Every single thing that man could use against us, because I didn't marry you to be protected from the truth. I married you to be trusted with it." Something shifted in Caleb's face. Something that looked like a man realizing he'd underestimated what he'd been given. "All right," he said quietly. "Everything. Starting with why you really needed a wife by summer. Not the polite version you gave me on the wagon. The real one." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, and Naomi watched him decide right there in front of her whether to keep protecting her from the harder truth or finally hand it over whole. "Bank charter says a man's loan standing gets reviewed if there's a change in household," he said finally. "My mother's passing counted against me 2 years back. Bank claimed a widower running a ranch alone was a bigger risk. Tightened my terms, shortened my timeline. One of the board members quietly told me that a married man with a stable household might get better terms when this note came up for review. Might buy me another year, maybe 2, if I could show the bank I wasn't a man about to lose everything to grief and mismanagement." Naomi felt something cold slide down through her chest. "So I'm not just your wife. I'm collateral. A woman you brought in to make yourself look respectable to a bank. That's not—" Caleb stopped himself, and to his credit, he didn't try to soften it the second time. "That's part of it. I won't lie to you and call it nothing, but it isn't all of it, Naomi. I answered dozens of letters before yours. I could have married any woman willing to say yes fast enough to matter for the bank's timeline. I chose yours because it was honest, because something about the way you wrote made me believe you'd tell me the truth even when it cost you something. I didn't marry a stranger to save a ranch. I married the one woman whose letter made me think I might actually want to keep her around long after the note's paid or lost. That's a fine speech for a man who let me find out the real reason from a banker's mouth instead of his own. I know it. Say it again, that you know it." "I know it," Caleb said, meeting her eyes without flinching. "I was wrong not to tell you before the church. I told myself I'd explain it once you'd settled in, once you'd seen enough of me to trust that I meant the rest of what I wrote. That was a coward's plan, and I see that now standing here watching your face." Naomi studied him a long moment, weighing the apology the way she weighed everything, testing its weight against the shape of the man giving it. "I don't scare easy, Caleb Whitmore. I've buried a mother worked kitchens that would break most men and crossed 3 states on a train ticket I could barely afford, all without anybody's help. I can survive a hard truth. What I can't survive is a husband who thinks I'm too fragile to be told one. You won't have that problem again. See that I don't." The lamp guttered low, and outside a dog barked once at something in the dark and went quiet. Naomi felt the exhaustion of the whole day finally catching up to her, the mockery on the platform, the 11-minute ceremony. The wagon ride, the 2-hour battle with a filthy stove, the supper, the pie, Pruitt's cold eyes on the porch, and now this, the whole shape of the trap she'd married into, laid bare on a kitchen table that still smelled faintly of peach and cinnamon. "I'm going to bed," she said. "Tomorrow you're going to show me every piece of paper connected to that loan. Every letter from the bank, every note Pruitt's ever sent you, every deed and record you've got in this house. If I'm going to fight for this ranch, I intend to know exactly what I'm fighting." Something that might have been the first real smile she'd seen from him all day tugged at the corner of Caleb's mouth. "You planning on fighting a banker with paperwork?" "I've fought worse men with less," Naomi said. "A banker's just a bully who learned to write his threats down instead of shouting them. I can read." She left him standing in the kitchen and did not look back to see the expression on his face, though she could feel it following her all the way down the hall. Morning came hard and bright, the kind of summer light that made everything on the ranch look scoured clean, and Naomi was up before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, already moving through the kitchen with the same efficient purpose she'd brought to it the night before. She had breakfast on the table, eggs, thick bacon biscuits from the leftover dough she'd set to rise before bed, by the time the hands came stumbling in, and she watched with quiet satisfaction as Silas took one bite and closed his eyes like a man in church. "Ma'am," Otis said around a mouthful of eggs, "I've decided something important." "And what's that?" "I ain't eating another meal in town so long as you're cooking out here. Pruitt's Diner charges a man 40 cents for eggs that taste like they were fried in regret. I'd rather starve a little on the ride home than eat there again." Naomi felt a small private flicker of satisfaction at that, though she kept it off her face. "You're all welcome at this table every meal, so long as I'm standing at that stove." "That's mighty generous, ma'am, considering how little I did to deserve it," Silas said, still not quite able to look at her without a trace of the shame from the day before. "I meant to ask, was there something troubling you and the boss last night? Heard raised voices through the window when I came back for my hat." Naomi glanced at Caleb, who was watching her carefully across the table, clearly waiting to see how much of the truth she intended to share with men who worked for him, but hadn't yet earned every piece of it. "There's a note coming due on this ranch at summer's end," Naomi said plainly, because she'd decided somewhere in the night that hiding things from good men rarely ended well for anybody. "Grady Pruitt intends to call it in if we can't pay and take the land for himself. That's the truth of it, and I figured you all deserved to hear it plain instead of piecing it together from whispers in town." The table went quiet in a different way than it had the night before. No shame in this silence. Just the weight of men realizing their livelihoods hung on the same thread as their bosses. "How much is owed?" Otis asked. Caleb told them the figure, and Tobias let out a low whistle that earned him a sharp look from Silas. "That's a mountain of money," the boy said. "It is," Caleb agreed. "And I don't have a clean way over it yet, but I intend to find one before the summer's out, and I could use every one of you standing with me while I look." "You didn't need to ask that, boss," Silas said. And for the first time, Naomi heard something steady and loyal in his voice that hadn't been there on the wagon ride. "We're standing with you regardless, same as we would have if you'd married a woman twice as pretty and half as capable." "Watch it," Naomi said, but there was no real heat in it, and the table laughed, and for a moment, the weight of the note sitting over all their heads felt just slightly lighter for having been said out loud instead of carried alone. After breakfast, true to her word, Caleb spread every piece of paper he owned across the kitchen table. The original loan documents from 4 years back. His father's signature scrawled across the bottom in handwriting, gone shaky from age and worry. Letters from the bank notifying him of tightened terms. A stack of receipts showing every payment he'd managed to scrape together since. Naomi went through them methodically, the same way she went through a pantry before deciding what to cook, cataloging, comparing, looking for the kind of small inconsistency that a lifetime of being underestimated had taught her to notice in everything and everyone. "This interest rate," she said, tapping one line on the original loan document, "it's higher here than it is on this letter from 6 months later." Caleb leaned over her shoulder to look. "Bank raised rates on struggling accounts. Told me it was standard practice." "Maybe," Or maybe somebody adjusted a number after your father signed and never told him. Naomi set the two papers side by side, studying the numbers with the same intensity she'd once used counting the 11 minutes of her own wedding. I worked 2 years for a man in Kansas City who kept the books for half the boarding houses in that district. Learned more from watching him cheat widows out of their inheritances than I ever wanted to know. Numbers like to hide the truth in plain sight, Caleb. This one's hiding something. You think Pruitt forged the terms? I think, Naomi said carefully, that a man desperate enough to want your land for a railroad spur might be desperate enough to make sure the debt on it never quite gets easier to pay off. I can't prove it standing in this kitchen with 2 pieces of paper, but I intend to find out. Caleb studied her with something between disbelief and dawning respect. You came here to cook, Naomi. I came here to be your wife, she corrected. Cooking's just the part of me that shows up first. Give it time. You'll see the rest. The morning wore on into afternoon, and Naomi sent Tobias into town with a short list of supplies and a longer set of instructions to keep his ears open, because a boy of 16 tended to hear things grown men assumed he was too young to understand. He came back 3 hours later, dust on his boots and something troubled sitting behind his usual easy grin. Ma'am, he said, setting the supplies on the counter. I think you ought to know what folks in town are saying. Say it plain, Tobias. I don't scare easy. They're saying you're... He hesitated, cheeks going red. They're saying you tricked Caleb into marrying you. That you sent a false description of yourself in your letters on account of no honest woman looking like you do would ever have gotten a proposal otherwise. Mrs. Pruitt's been telling half the general store that you must have lied about your appearance to trap him. The kitchen went very quiet. Naomi felt the old familiar heat crawl up her neck, the same one she'd fought back on the platform and again in the ranch yard. Except this time, it burned hotter because this wasn't a stranger's cruel whisper. This was a lie, deliberate and pointed, and lies were a different animal than mere unkindness. I never lied in a single letter I wrote, Naomi said low and even. I told him plain in the very first line that I wasn't a beauty and didn't intend to pretend otherwise. If anyone wants to see the proof, they're welcome to ask Caleb to read it aloud. I believe you, ma'am. Everybody who's eaten your cooking believes you. It's the folks who ain't met you that are saying it. And where do you suppose Mrs. Pruitt got the notion to start saying it at all? Tobias's silence answered the question well enough. Caleb, who had come in partway through the exchange, set his hat down hard enough on the table to make the salt cellar jump. Grady's turning the town against you before you've even had a full week here. That's not a coincidence. That's a strategy. A strategy to do what? Naomi asked, though she suspected she already knew. To isolate us. Make it harder for us to get credit at the general store, harder for the hands to spend their wages in town without getting an earful, harder for anybody to want to do business with a ranch whose owner married a woman the whole town's been told is a liar and a swindler. He's not just trying to take the land through the bank. He's trying to make sure nobody in Miller's Bend feels sorry enough for us to help when the note comes due. Naomi felt something settle inside her hard and clear as the moment she'd decided on that train platform not to cry. Then we'll simply have to make sure this ranch doesn't need the town's sympathy. And how do you propose we do that? The same way I've survived every room that decided I wasn't worth respecting before I opened my mouth. Naomi began clearing the supplies off the counter with brisk, efficient motions, already 3 steps ahead in her mind, the way she always was. We make ourselves impossible to ignore. Starting with supper tonight, I want every hand on this ranch eating like kings, and I want word of it spreading through this town faster than Mrs. Pruitt's gossip ever could. Caleb watched her with an expression that had somewhere in the last day stopped being careful and started being something closer to wonder. You're not planning to hide from this. I've never hidden from anything in my life, Caleb Whitmore. I'm not about to start on account of a banker's wife with nothing better to do than lie about a woman she's never met. That evening's supper was, if anything, more determined than the first, and word of it did indeed spread. Otis mentioned it to a friend passing through. Silas couldn't help bragging at the feed store the next morning, and within 3 days the story of Caleb Whitmore's new bride and her cooking had become the kind of gossip that traveled faster than any lie Mrs. Pruitt could invent. Ranch hands from 2 neighboring spreads started finding excuses to ride by around supper time. The blacksmith's apprentice delivering a repaired plow blade lingered in the yard, until Naomi, taking pity, handed him a biscuit through the window and watched him ride off looking like he'd been given gold. But not everyone in Miller's Bend was so easily won over, and the first real test of it came 8 days after the wedding, when Caleb needed supplies from town, and Naomi insisted on riding along. "You don't need to do this," Caleb said, hitching the wagon while she climbed up beside him with the same steady determination she brought to everything. "Town's not kind to you yet. Might not be for a while. All the more reason to go," Naomi said. "A woman who hides from unkindness teaches people that unkindness works. I learned that lesson the hard way a long time ago, and I don't intend to unlearn it now." The ride into Miller's Bend was quiet. The town itself, smaller and rougher than the boarding house streets Naomi had known, but the moment the wagon rolled past the first storefronts, she felt the eyes on her, the same way she had on the platform, except this time she noticed some of those eyes weren't cruel, so much as curious, watching to see if the stories matched the woman. Grady Pruitt's diner sat near the center of town, its windows freshly painted, its sign declaring Pruitt's Table in letters gilded enough to catch the sun. Naomi watched Caleb's jaw tighten as they passed it, and she understood in that moment exactly how much of the town's daily business ran through that one building. Meals gossip deals struck over coffee, favors traded over pie. It was, she realized, not just a diner. It was Pruitt's second bank, a place where he collected information and loyalty the same way his real bank collected interest. They were halfway through loading flour and salt at the general store when Grady Pruitt himself stepped out of his diner across the street, unhurried already. Smiling that thin smile Naomi had come to recognize as a warning rather than a welcome. "Caleb!" he called, crossing toward them with the easy confidence of a man who owned most of what he surveyed. "And Mrs. Whitmore. Didn't expect to see you in town so soon given everything folks have been saying." "I imagine you've heard plenty of what folks have been saying," Naomi said evenly, setting down a sack of flour with more force than strictly necessary. "Seeing as your wife appears to be the one saying most of it." Something flickered behind Pruitt's smile. Surprise, maybe, that the plain, quiet bride he'd sized up on the porch a week ago had a tongue as sharp as her cooking was rumored to be. "My wife speaks her mind. Can't fault a woman for that." "No," Naomi agreed. "I can't fault her for speaking her mind. I can fault her for lying, though, and I intend to correct the record every chance I get. I never once misrepresented myself in a single letter to your bank's most troublesome debtor. Every word I wrote was true, including the part where I told him plainly I wasn't a beauty. If your wife would like to see the letters herself, she's welcome to read them at my kitchen table over a meal, so she can taste exactly what kind of woman she's been slandering." A small crowd had begun to gather near the general store's entrance, drawn by the tension, the way Naomi imagined they'd once have been drawn to a fistfight, the same hungry curiosity dressed up as errands that suddenly required standing very still nearby. Pruitt's smile thinned further, the polish on it cracking just slightly at the edges. "You've got quite a bit of nerve for a woman who's been married a week." "I've had 31 years to build that nerve, Mr. Pruitt. Marriage just gave me a reason to finally spend it on somebody worth defending." The crowd's murmur shifted something in it that sounded almost like approval, and Naomi watched Pruitt notice it too. Watched him recalculate the way Caleb had recalculated on the train platform, except Pruitt's math clearly wasn't landing anywhere he liked. "Careful, Mrs. Whitmore," he said, voice dropping low enough that only those closest could hear it. "A ranch with a note coming due doesn't need more enemies in this town. You'd do well to remember whose good graces your husband's future depends on." "My husband's future," Naomi said, holding his gaze without blinking, "depends on paying an honest debt in full, which he intends to do. If you're implying it depends on something else, on my silence, or my fear, or my willingness to let your wife spread lies about me unanswered, then you've badly misjudged the woman you're threatening." For a moment, nobody moved. Caleb had gone very still beside her, one hand resting near her elbow, not pulling her back, just present the way he'd been present on the wagon ride home from the station there. If she needed him, trusting her enough not to need to be anything more than that. Pruitt recovered first, tipping his hat with a gesture that had gone from courteous to openly hostile somewhere in the last 30 seconds. "We'll see how brave you feel come autumn, Mrs. Whitmore." He turned to Caleb. "Notes still due regardless of how sharp your wife's tongue is. Sharper words don't pay debts." "No," Caleb said, speaking for the first time since Pruitt had crossed the street, his voice carrying the same flat, immovable quality it had held the night before. "But hard work does, and honest accounting does, and I intend to bring you both come autumn down to the last dollar owed. You'll get your money, Grady, just not your land." Pruitt's eyes narrowed, and for just a moment, something uglier than irritation crossed his face. Something closer to real anger, the anger of a man watching a plan he'd been certain of start to wobble. "We'll see," he said again, and walked back across the street toward his gilded diner without another word. The crowd dispersed slowly, murmuring, and Naomi caught more than one glance thrown her way that held something other than judgment, a kind of startled respect. The look people gave someone who'd just done something they hadn't expected and weren't yet sure how to feel about. An older woman, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, approached as Caleb finished loading the wagon. "You're the one who's been feeding half the ranch hands in the valley," she said, not quite a question. "I suppose I am. My grandson rides for the Talbot spread 2 miles east. Says your biscuits are the reason half his crew has stopped complaining about their wages." The woman's mouth twitched almost a smile. "Wanted to see for myself what kind of woman was causing that much talk." "And what have you decided?" "That Grady Pruitt picked a poor week to make an enemy of you." The woman nodded once, sharp and satisfied, and walked off before Naomi could think of anything to say in response. The ride home was quieter than the ride into town, but it carried a different weight than the silence from the platform a week before. Not tension, but something closer to shared resolve. Two people who had just stood together in front of a hostile crowd and come out the other side with their footing still solid beneath them. "You didn't have to say all that," Caleb said, finally, eyes on the road. "Could have let me handle Pruitt myself. I've spent my whole life letting other people decide what I could and couldn't handle," Naomi said. "I don't intend to spend my marriage doing the same. Besides," she allowed herself a small, tired smile. Somebody needed to remind that man that not every woman he underestimates is going to stay quiet about it. Caleb glanced at her, something warm and unguarded in his expression that hadn't been there on the wagon ride out from the station. "I'm starting to think Grady Pruitt has no idea what he just married into a fight with." "He'll learn," Naomi said. "Slowly and the hard way. Men like him usually do." They rode the rest of the way in a silence that felt for the first time since she'd stepped off that train, like something closer to peace, right up until they crested the last rise before the ranch house and saw the thin column of smoke rising from the direction of the barn. Caleb's whole body went rigid beside her. "That's not supposed to be there." He snapped the reins hard, and the wagon lurched forward, and Naomi gripped the seat with both hands as the ranch came into view fully, the smoke thicker now, curling black against the pale afternoon sky. And somewhere ahead of them, she could hear Otis shouting, and Silas's voice cutting through it sharp with something that sounded very much like fear. The wagon hadn't fully stopped before Caleb was down and running, and Naomi followed as fast as her skirts allowed, her heart hammering with a fear that had nothing to do with fire and everything to do with what fire on this particular afternoon, on this particular ranch, might actually mean. The hay shed at the edge of the barn was burning flames, licking up the dry timber faster than any of the men could contain with the buckets they were hauling from the trough. Tobias was soaked through hair, plastered to his forehead, running back and forth so fast he nearly collided with Silas twice. Otis had a wet burlap sack in each hand, beating at the flames along the shed's lower edge where they threatened to catch the fence rail. "Get the horses out first," Caleb shouted, already moving toward the main barn where the animals were stamping and screaming against their stalls, the smell of smoke driving them into a panic that could kill them faster than any flame. "Naomi, keep back from the shed, it's going to—" The words died as a support beam gave way with a crack loud enough to echo off the hills, and the shed's roof folded inward, sending up a fresh column of sparks that scattered wide on the afternoon wind. Naomi didn't keep back. She grabbed the nearest bucket, filled it at the trough, and joined the line without waiting to be told. Twice her arms burning within minutes from the effort, her lungs stinging with smoke. But she didn't stop, because stopping had never once solved a single problem in her whole life, and she wasn't about to start believing it would now. It took the better part of an hour to beat the fire down to smoldering ash, and by the time it was done, the hay shed was a ruin. The fence along its western edge, scorched black, and every person on that ranch stood soot-streaked and exhausted in the fading afternoon light, staring at what was left. How'd it start? Caleb asked, his voice hoarse from smoke and shouting, looking at Silas, who'd been closest to the shed when it caught. That's the thing, boss. Silas wiped his forehead with a filthy sleeve, and something uneasy sat behind his eyes. Wasn't nobody near that shed all afternoon. No lanterns lit out here in daylight. No reason for a spark to start on its own, not with the haystack the way we stack it away from the walls. You're saying somebody set it. I'm saying I don't know how else a fire starts in a shed nobody's touched since this morning. Otis, coming up behind them with his ruined burlap sack still smoking faintly at the edges, nodded grimly. Found this caught in the fence rail on the far side, boss. Wind must have carried it, or somebody left it in a hurry. He held out a scrap of cloth charred at one corner, but still recognizably finer than anything a ranch hand would own, finer than anything that belonged anywhere near a hay shed by accident. Naomi took it from him, turning it over in her soot-blackened hands, and felt something cold and certain settle into place beside the exhaustion and the fear. The fabric was the same weight, the same quality as the suit she'd watched Grady Pruitt wear onto their porch 8 days before. "Caleb," she said quietly. He looked at the scrap in her hands, and understanding moved across his face like a shadow, dark and immediate. "That doesn't prove anything," he said, though the words came out strained, like he didn't fully believe them himself. "Could belong to anybody who's passed through this land in the last month." "Could," Naomi agreed. "Or it could belong to a man who told us not 8 hours ago that we'd see how brave we felt come autumn. A man who just watched his diner lose business to a woman he can't control, and his bank's leverage weaken every day. This ranch keeps standing on its own 2 feet. She closed her hand around the scrap of fabric, feeling the fragile, damning weight of it. "I don't believe in coincidences, Caleb. Not on the same day I stood in the street and told that man to his face that he'd badly misjudged me." Caleb stared out at the ruined shed, at the black scar it had left against the golden evening light, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost every trace of the warmth it had carried on the ride home from town. "If Grady Pruitt just declared war on this ranch," he said, "then he's about to find out exactly what kind of woman he's made an enemy of." Behind them, the last embers of the hay shed hissed and settled into the dark, and somewhere out past the ridge, a horse Naomi didn't recognize whinnied once in the distance, and was gone. Nobody slept much that night. Caleb walked the fence line twice with a lantern, before Naomi finally convinced him to come inside, and even then he sat at the kitchen table until well past midnight, turning the scorched scrap of fabric over in his hands, like it might tell him something new if he looked at it long enough. "You keep staring at that thing," Naomi said, setting a cup of coffee in front of him. "And you're going to wear a hole clean through it before it tells you anything more than it already has." "It's not enough," Caleb said. "You know that as well as I do. A burnt scrap of good cloth doesn't hold up in front of a judge. Doesn't even hold up in front of the sheriff, and the sheriff owes half his salary to favors Pruitt's bank has done him over the years. Then we find something that does hold up, such as..." Naomi sat down across from him, wrapping both hands around her own cup, feeling the exhaustion of the day settle into her shoulders, even as her mind kept working the way it always did, refusing to rest until it had turned a problem over from every angle. "You told me the interest rate on your father's note doesn't match between the original document and the letter from 6 months later. If somebody altered those numbers after the fact, there'll be a record of it somewhere that isn't in your kitchen. County Recorder's Office keeps copies of every loan filed against property in this territory. If the number filed there matches what your father actually signed, And it's different from what Pruitt's bank has been charging you. That's not a coincidence anymore. That's proof. Caleb studied her across the table, something working behind his tired eyes. County seat's a full day's ride each direction. Then we'd best leave at first light. Somebody needs to stay and watch the ranch. After today, I'm not leaving it unguarded. Silas and Otis can manage that. Tobias too, if it comes to it. This is worth 2 days away, Caleb. If Pruitt's willing to burn a shed to frighten us, he's not going to stop there, and paperwork won't save this ranch if it's already ash. Naomi reached across the table and put her hand over his, the first time she'd touched him without reason since the wagon ride from the station. But paperwork might be the one thing that stops him before it comes to that. Caleb turned his hand over beneath hers, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. They left before dawn, the ranch still gray and half asleep behind them, Silas standing in the yard with a rifle across his arm, and a look on his face that said, plainer than words, that nothing was going to get near that ranch while he was breathing. The ride to the county seat took the better part of the day, dust and heat wearing on both of them. But Naomi found herself grateful for the silence of it, the chance to think, without the constant threat hovering at the edge of every hour. The recorder's office was a narrow brick building tucked behind the courthouse, run by a thin, spectacled clerk named Mr. Abernathy, who looked like he'd spent his whole life buried under paper and had made a kind of peace with it. He listened to Caleb's request with the mild, unbothered patience of a man who'd heard 1,000 strange requests before and found none of them worth much excitement. "Whitmore loan filed 4 years back," he murmured, pulling a heavy ledger down from a high shelf. "Pruitt Bank of Miller's Bend. Yes, here it is." He ran a finger down the page, lips moving slightly as he read. "Original filing shows an interest rate of 6% standard for the territory that year." 6%, Caleb repeated. "The letter I've got from the bank 6 months later cites 8. Abernathy's finger stopped. He read the line again, then flipped forward through the ledger, comparing something Naomi couldn't see from where she stood. "That's unusual," he said slowly. "Filed rate 6. If your bank's been charging 8 without a corresponding amendment filed here, that's well. That's not how the law intends it to work." "Would you be willing to say that to a judge?" Naomi asked. Abernathy looked up at her over his spectacles, and something in his careful, bureaucratic face shifted a flicker of the kind of quiet outrage that men who loved their paperwork sometimes felt on behalf of the numbers they protected. "Ma'am, I don't involve myself in disputes between banks and their debtors as a rule, but an unfiled rate change on a note this size isn't a small oversight. If it's true, and I've no reason yet to think otherwise, that's the kind of irregularity that could void the entire note, or worse for the bank that wrote it." Naomi felt something click into place, sharp and satisfying, as the moment a stubborn lock finally gave. "Would you make us a certified copy of this page? Something we could carry with us. Something with your seal on it, proving what's filed here doesn't match what Pruitt's bank has been demanding." "That I can do," Abernathy said, already reaching for his stamp. "Whatever's happening out at Miller's Bend, Mrs. Whitmore, I'd say you've just found yourself the first real crack in it." They rode back through the night rather than wait for morning. Both of them, too, charged with the discovery to think of sleep, the certified copy tucked safe inside Naomi's coat, like it was made of something more precious than paper. The stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere past midnight, Caleb finally broke the long, comfortable silence that had settled between them. "You did that," he said. "Found the crack. I've been staring at that loan for 2 years and never once thought to ride to the county seat and check it against what's actually filed." "You were too close to it," Naomi said. "Man drowning doesn't stop to study the water. He just fights to keep his head up. I came into this with clear eyes is all. Wasn't smarter, just less tired." "I don't believe that's all it was." She glanced over at him, at the shape of his jaw in the moonlight, at the steady way he held the reins even after a full day and night of hard riding. "Believe what you like, Caleb Whitmore. Just don't let it stop you from riding straight home and getting some sleep before you fall clean off that horse." They reached the ranch just as the sky was starting to gray toward morning, and the sight that greeted them stopped Caleb's horse dead in the yard. Silas was standing on the porch, rifle still in hand, and beside him stood a thin, nervous man Naomi had never seen before, hat clutched to his chest, like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "Boss?" Silas called, relief plain in his voice at the sight of them. "This is Mr. Dunmore. Says he used to keep books for Pruitt's bank. Says he's got something he needs to tell you, and he's been waiting on this porch since sundown, too scared to go home." Dunmore stepped forward, and up close Naomi could see the sleeplessness carved into his face, the particular exhaustion of a man who'd been carrying something heavy for far too long. "Mr. Whitmore," he said, voice trembling slightly. "I worked for Grady Pruitt for 6 years, kept his ledgers filed, his paperwork, did whatever he told me to do, because he paid well, and I had a family to feed. 3 years ago, he had me change the interest figure on your father's note after it was already signed. Told me it was standard practice. Told me every bank did it. Told me if I said a word to anybody he'd see to it. I never worked in this territory again." The yard went very still. Even the birds seemed to have gone quiet, or maybe Naomi simply couldn't hear them over the sound of her own pulse. "Why come forward now?" Caleb asked, his voice careful, like a man handling something fragile that might shatter if he moved too fast. "Because I heard what happened to your hay shed," Dunmore said. "And because my own conscience has been eating at me longer than I care to admit, and because I heard in town yesterday that your wife stood in the middle of the street and told Grady Pruitt to his face that she wasn't afraid of him." He looked at Naomi with something like desperate hope. "I figured if a woman like that could stand up to him after 1 week in this town, maybe I could finally stand up to him after 3 years of being too much of a coward too." Naomi felt something rise in her chest, fierce and warm all at once. "Mr. Dunmore, would you be willing to put what you just told us in writing, sign your name to it in front of a witness?" "I would," Dunmore said, and though his voice still shook, there was something steadier underneath it now. The sound of a man finally setting down a weight he'd carried too long. "I brought the original ledger pages with me. Kept copies hidden for 3 years in case I ever found the nerve to use them. Guess I finally found it." Caleb looked at the man, then at Naomi, then at the certified copy still tucked inside her coat. And something in his exhausted face broke open into an expression Naomi hadn't seen from him yet. Not relief exactly, but the beginning of it. The first true glimpse of a man who could see for the first time in years. A path that didn't end with losing everything his family had built. "Come inside, Mr. Dunmore," Naomi said. "You look like a man who could use a hot meal and a safe place to sit while we sort this out properly." They spent the whole of that day at the kitchen table. Dunmore's ledger pages spread out alongside the certified copy from the county seat. The pieces of Pruitt's fraud laying themselves out plain and undeniable in black ink and careful handwriting. Naomi fed them all. Dunmore Caleb Silas, who refused to leave the house once he understood what was happening, and between bites of stew, the shape of a plan began to form. "This isn't enough to just march into his bank and demand he tear up the note," Caleb said, studying the papers for the 10th time that afternoon. "Man like Pruitt has friends, judges who owe him favors, sheriff who looks the other way. If we go at him quiet, he'll bury this evidence, and bury Dunmore right along with it." "Then we don't go at him quiet," Naomi said. "We go at him in front of the whole town." Caleb looked up. "What are you thinking?" Miller's Bend holds a town meeting the first Saturday of every month. Every rancher, every merchant, everyone with a stake in this valley shows up to that meeting hall to hear about roads and taxes and whatever else the town council thinks needs airing. Pruitt sits on that council. He'll be there same as always, expecting nothing more exciting than an argument about fence law. Naomi tapped the certified copy with one finger. "We bring this, all of it. In front of every person in this town who's ever done business with that man, we lay out exactly what he did to your father's note, and we let Mr. Dunmore say in his own words exactly how he was made to do it." Silas let out a low whistle. "That's a bold plan, ma'am. Man like Pruitt won't take kindly to being called out that public. Man like Pruitt has spent 2 years trying to take everything this family's built without ever once having to answer for it in front of the people whose respect he still wants to keep. I intend to make sure that stops." Dunmore, quiet through most of the discussion, finally spoke. "He'll come after me for this. You understand that?" If I stand up in that hall and say what I told you, Grady Pruitt won't rest until he's ruined me." "You let us worry about that," Caleb said. "You've carried this alone long enough. You won't be standing up there by yourself." The next 4 days passed in a blur of quiet preparation, the ranch feeling less like a household bracing for disaster and more like an army readying for a battle. It finally had a real chance of winning. Naomi kept the meals coming, kept the hands fed and steady, kept Dunmore hidden safely in the spare room off the kitchen where Pruitt's men, if they came looking, would have to walk through her kitchen to find him. And Naomi had made it clear, without needing to raise her voice, that nobody was walking through her kitchen uninvited. That resolve was tested on the second night when Tobias came pounding up from the barn, well past midnight, breathless and wide-eyed, banging on the kitchen door, hard enough to wake the whole house. "Riders!" he gasped the moment Caleb pulled the door open. 2 of them coming up the south track slow, like they don't want to be heard. I was checking on the horses on account of they'd gone skittish, and I saw lantern light where there shouldn't be any. Caleb was already reaching for his rifle. "Get Silas, get Otis, and you stay in this house. You hear me, whatever happens outside." "Boss, You can protect Mr. Dunmore," Naomi said, sharply, already moving to bar the spare room door from the outside. Her own heart hammering, though her voice stayed level. "That's the job that matters most tonight, Tobias. Can I trust you with it?" The boy straightened, some of the fear in his face hardening into something closer to purpose. "Yes, ma'am." Caleb and Silas met the riders at the edge of the yard, and Naomi stood at the kitchen window with a shotgun she hadn't touched since Kansas City, watching 2 shapes on horseback pull up short at the sight of armed men waiting for them in the dark. "Evening!" One of the riders called, his voice carrying a false, easy friendliness that didn't fool anyone. "Didn't mean to come by so late. Mr. Pruitt sent us to check on a debt owed to the bank is all. Nothing more than that. Bank business gets conducted in daylight through proper channels," Caleb said, his rifle steady in his hands. "You've got exactly 1 minute to turn around before I decide you're trespassing on posted land. No need for that kind of talk. 50 seconds. The 2 riders exchanged a glance, some silent calculation passing between them, and whatever they'd been sent to do, search the property, frighten the household. Perhaps find and silence Dunmore before he could speak a word in that meeting hall. They clearly decided it wasn't worth the cost of finding out how serious Caleb's threat really was. They turned their horses and rode off the way they'd come, and Naomi didn't lower the shotgun until the sound of hoofbeats had faded completely into the dark. Silas found her still standing at the window. Minutes later, her hands trembling now that the danger had passed, the way hands always seemed to remember to shake only once the crisis was already over. "You did good, ma'am," he said quietly. "Man doesn't send 2 riders in the middle of the night unless he's scared of what's coming for him." "He should be scared," Naomi said, setting the shotgun down carefully on the table. "Fear's the only language men like Pruitt ever bothered learning fluently. Word traveled anyway, the way word always did, in a town small enough to run on gossip, the way a larger place ran on newspapers. By the 3rd day, Otis reported that Pruitt had been seen riding hard between his bank and the sheriff's office twice in one afternoon, his easy confidence looking noticeably thinner around the edges. "Man knows something's coming," Otis said, setting down a fresh-plucked chicken on Naomi's counter. "Just doesn't know exactly what or from where." "Let him wonder," Naomi said. "Wondering's its own kind of punishment for a man used to knowing everything before anybody else does." The night before the town meeting, Naomi sat with Caleb on the porch steps, the summer air still warm even after the sun had gone down. The ranch quiet around them in a way that felt for the first time in days almost peaceful. "You scared?" Caleb asked. "Terrified," Naomi admitted, surprising herself with the honesty of it. "Not of Pruitt. Of what happens to Dunmore's family if this goes wrong. Of what happens to this ranch, to your men, to you, if I've pushed us into a fight we can't win. You didn't push us into anything. Grady Pruitt pushed us into this the day he took a bribe to forge my father's signature onto a debt that was never supposed to grow the way it has. All we're doing tomorrow is finally making him answer for it in front of people who deserve to know what kind of man's been sitting on their town council all these years." Naomi leaned her head against his shoulder, an easy, unthinking gesture that surprised her, even as she did it, and felt him go still for a moment, before relaxing into it, one arm coming around her, without either of them making a show of the moment. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, "I want you to know I don't regret a single mile of that train ride. Not the laughing on the platform, not the note, not the fire. All of it brought me here to this exact porch, and I find I wouldn't trade it for an easier road." "Wouldn't trade you for one either," Caleb said quietly, and neither of them said anything else because nothing else needed saying. The town meeting hall was packed tighter than Naomi had ever seen, a room word of something significant having spread through Miller's Bend, the way fire had spread through the hayshed just days before, fast, unstoppable, drawing everyone toward the heat of it, whether they meant to be drawn or not. Ranchers from 3 neighboring spreads had ridden in. The general store owner stood near the back, arms crossed. The gray-haired woman from the street outside the diner had a seat near the front, watching everything with sharp, satisfied eyes. Grady Pruitt sat at the council table at the front of the hall, immaculate as always, his thin smile firmly back in place, clearly having convinced himself that whatever storm was coming, he was more than prepared to weather it. The meeting opened with the usual dry business, a dispute over a shared well, a proposal for repairing the bridge on the North Road, and Naomi felt the tension in the room build with every passing minute, every person present clearly aware that the real business of the evening hadn't yet begun. When the council chairman finally called for any other matters the town needed to address, Caleb stood. "I've got something," he said, his voice carrying clear and steady across the packed hall. "Concerning a note held by Pruitt Bank against my family's ranch and the manner in which that note's terms were changed without my father's knowledge or consent." A murmur rippled through the room. Pruitt's smile didn't move, but Naomi, watching closely, saw something flicker behind his eyes, the first crack of genuine uncertainty she'd seen on him since the porch 8 days, and what felt like a lifetime ago. "Caleb," Pruitt said, voice smooth and public, pitched for the whole room to hear. "This hardly seems the place to air a private financial dispute." "It stopped being private," Caleb said. "The moment your bank started using forged terms to squeeze a family off land, it's held for 3 generations. And it stopped being just my dispute the moment I learned I wasn't the only debtor in this valley whose numbers might not match what's actually on file at the county seat." The murmur grew louder. Naomi rose to her feet beside Caleb, the certified copy in one hand, Dunmore's signed statement in the other, and felt every eye in that hall shift toward her the same weight of attention she'd felt on the train platform 2 weeks ago. Except this time she welcomed it, stood taller under it, let it fuel her instead of shrinking her. "My name is Naomi Whitmore," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her own heart. 2 weeks ago I stepped off a train into this town and was laughed at for how I looked before I'd said a single word to anyone here. I've since learned that this town has a much larger problem than one plain woman's appearance. It has a banker willing to forge loan documents to steal land out from under families who trusted him. That is a serious accusation, the council chairman said, and one this council will need considerably more than a woman's word to... "She's not asking you to take her word for it," Caleb interrupted. "She's asking you to look at the evidence." He nodded to Naomi, who stepped forward and laid the certified copy on the council table with a steady hand. "This is a certified copy from the county recorder's office," Naomi said, showing the interest rate originally filed on the Whitmore loan 4 years ago, 6%, standard for the territory. I would ask this council to compare that figure against whatever rate Pruitt Bank has been charging since. The chairman took the paper, studied it, and his expression shifted from mild irritation to something considerably more alert. "This says 6%. Bank's been charging 8 for the last 3 years, Caleb said. Never filed the change with the county. Never had my father's signature on any amendment authorizing it. I have every letter from the bank demanding that higher rate and not one document showing it was ever legally changed." Pruitt was on his feet now, his composure cracking visibly for the first time. "This is absurd. Rates get adjusted for risk assessment all the time. It's standard banking practice, and I won't stand here and be accused of..." "Then perhaps," Naomi said, cutting through his protest with the same calm, unshakable voice she'd used on the man himself just 8 days before. You'd care to explain why your former bookkeeper is prepared to testify under his own signature, that you personally instructed him to alter that figure after my father-in-law had already signed the original document. The hall went utterly silent. What bookkeeper? Pruitt said, and for the first time since Naomi had met him, his voice had lost every trace of its practiced smoothness. The door at the back of the hall opened, and Dunmore walked in, pale but upright, flanked by Silas and Otis, who had ridden ahead an hour earlier to fetch him at the exact moment Naomi had calculated would do the most damage to Pruitt's composure. Every head in the room turned to watch him walk the length of the aisle, and Naomi felt the whole hall hold its breath along with her. "Tell them, Mr. Dunmore," she said quietly. "Tell them exactly what you told us." Dunmore stopped at the front of the hall, faced the council, and though his hands trembled slightly at his sides, his voice, when it came, was clear enough to carry to every corner of the room. "I worked for Grady Pruitt's bank for 6 years, he said. 3 years ago, he called me into his office and told me to change the interest figure on the Whitmore note from 6% to 8%, after Robert Whitmore had already signed the original paperwork. Told me it was how the bank did business with families it considered a poor risk. Told me if I ever spoke a word of it to anyone, he'd ruin my name so thoroughly I'd never find honest work in this territory again." The hall erupted into noise. Shouts, murmurs, someone near the back demanding the sheriff be called. The council chairman banging his gavel for order that took a long moment to arrive. Pruitt's face had gone the color of old ash, his eyes darting from Dunmore to Naomi to the certified copy still sitting on the council table, and for the first time since she'd watched him step off his porch a week and a half ago, Grady Pruitt looked like a man who understood fully and finally exactly how much trouble he was in. "This man is lying," Pruitt said, but the words came out thin, unconvincing. Nothing like the smooth authority he'd carried into every other conversation Naomi had witnessed him have. "He was dismissed from my employ for incompetence. Of course he'd invent something like this to settle a grudge. I've got copies of the original ledger pages," Dunmore said, pulling a folded stack of papers from inside his coat, with hands that shook but didn't stop. "Kept them hidden 3 years, in case I ever found the courage to use them. My handwriting's on every page, Mr. Pruitt. Same as yours is on the instructions I copied down the day you told me to change that figure. If you'd like to call me a liar in front of this whole town, I'd invite the council to compare my handwriting to what's already on file with every other document this bank's ever produced." The chairman took the ledger pages, studied them alongside the certified copy, and when he looked up, his expression had hardened into something Naomi recognized instantly, the look of a man who just realized he could no longer pretend not to see what was directly in front of him. "Mr. Pruitt," the chairman said slowly, "this council is going to need to suspend tonight's remaining business. I believe what we're looking at here requires considerably more than a town meeting can properly address." "You can't be serious," Pruitt said, but the room around him had already begun to turn dozens of faces that had known him for years now, looking at him with something between disbelief and disgust. The careful reputation he'd spent decades building, cracking open in real time in front of the very people whose respect had always been his most valuable currency. Naomi felt Caleb's hand find hers under the table, steady and sure, and she squeezed it once hard, though her eyes never left Grady Pruitt's face. "Sheriff needs to be sent for," someone called from the back of the hall. "Tonight, before he has a chance to burn anything else." Pruitt's head snapped toward the voice, and something in his expression shifted one final time from panic into something colder. Something calculating the look of a cornered animal deciding whether to run or fight. "You've made a grave mistake," he said, his voice low, now meant only for Naomi and Caleb, though half the hall could still hear it. "Both of you. You think exposing a little paperwork irregularity in front of these people changes anything about who actually holds power in this valley? I think," Naomi said, holding his gaze without flinching, the same way she'd held it on the street outside his diner, "that you're about to find out exactly how much power a man loses the moment the whole town stops believing his lies. Pruitt's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Naomi thought he might say something else, might unleash whatever threat was clearly building behind his cold, calculating eyes. But instead, he turned, pushed past the council table, and walked out through the side door of the hall without another word, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than anything that had come before it. The chairman cleared his throat. "This meeting is adjourned. Mr. Whitmore, Mrs. Whitmore, Mr. Dunmore. I'd ask the three of you to remain. We'll need statements, and I imagine the sheriff will want them as well, assuming he can still be trusted to enforce the law where Grady Pruitt is concerned." As the hall began to empty, murmuring and buzzing with the kind of shock that would keep Miller's Bend talking for weeks, the gray-haired woman from the street stopped beside Naomi's chair, resting one weathered hand briefly on her shoulder. "Told you he'd picked a poor week to make an enemy of you," she said, and there was real warmth in it now, no trace of the careful testing curiosity from before. "Didn't expect the whole thing to unravel quite this fast, though." "Neither did I," Naomi admitted. Silas and Otis pushed through the thinning crowd to reach them, both men wearing the same stunned, satisfied look of soldiers who'd just watched a battle turn in their favor faster than they'd dared hope. "Ma'am," Silas said, "I don't rightly know what to call what you just did in there, but I know I've never seen anybody take a man like Pruitt apart so clean in front of a whole town." "We did it," Naomi corrected. "Every one of us. Mr. Dunmore most of all, for finally finding the courage to say what he'd carried alone for 3 years. Dunmore, still pale, but standing straighter than he had all evening, managed a small exhausted smile. "Couldn't have found it without watching a woman half my size stare that man down in the street first, ma'am. Figured if you could do that after a week in this town, I owed it to my own conscience to try." But even as the relief of it settled over her, even as Caleb's hand stayed warm and steady around hers, Naomi couldn't shake the cold certainty of Pruitt's parting words, the promise buried inside the threat. And somewhere out past the meeting hall's open door, she thought she heard the sound of a horse being spurred hard into the dark, moving fast, moving away from town in the direction that led, if she remembered the map correctly, straight back toward the ranch. "Caleb." Naomi's fingers tightened around his hand. "That's toward the ranch." He was already moving, pulling her toward the door, calling for Silas and Otis before she'd even finished the sentence. "Sheriff," he barked at the chairman as they passed, "send him after us the second he's able. Don't wait on ceremony." They rode hard through the dark, Naomi clinging to the back of Caleb's saddle because there hadn't been time to hitch her own horse, the wind tearing at her hair, and her hastily pinned bonnet long since lost somewhere behind them on the road. Every mile felt like 10. Every shadow along the tree line, like it might be Pruitt waiting, with worse than words this time, and Naomi found herself praying in a way she hadn't since her mother's funeral, quiet and desperate, and entirely without shame. "He wouldn't," Caleb said once more to himself, then to her the words torn away by the wind, almost as soon as he spoke them. "Man's cornered, not stupid." "Cornered men do stupid things," Naomi shouted back over the pounding of hooves. "That's the whole danger of cornering one." The ranch house came into view with lantern light already burning in the yard, and for one terrible second, Naomi's heart seized at the thought of another fire. But the light was steady, unmoving, and as they thundered closer, she made out shapes standing near the porch. Tobias. And beside him, rifle raised, one arm braced against the porch post, like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Grady Pruitt stood in the yard, a pistol in his hand, and it was pointed at Tobias. "Boy wouldn't tell me where you keep the rest of that paperwork," Pruitt said, his voice stripped of every trace of its practiced smoothness, now raw and frantic in a way that frightened Naomi far more than his cold composure ever had. "Figured I'd wait for somebody who might." Caleb pulled up hard, swinging down from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped, and Naomi slid down after him, her legs unsteady beneath her, but her voice when it came steadier than she expected. "Put it down, Grady," she said. "It's over. The whole town watched Dunmore lay it all out not 2 hours ago. There isn't a piece of paper left in that house that changes what happens to you now." "Everything changes," Pruitt snapped, "if there's no witness left standing to swear to it in front of a judge." Naomi felt the ground tilt beneath her. "You're not talking about paper anymore. I'm talking about survival. Pruitt said, and something in his eyes had gone past desperate into something far more dangerous, the look of a man who'd already calculated he had nothing left to lose. You have any idea what happens to a man in my position once a town turns on him? I've got debts of my own, Mrs. Whitmore. Debts to men considerably less patient than I've been with your husband. This land was supposed to cover what I owe them. Without it, I'm not just ruined. I'm finished one way or another, and I intend to make sure I'm not finished alone. Debts to who? Caleb asked, keeping his voice level, buying time, the only way he knew how. Who's above you in this, Grady? You didn't dream up a railroad scheme sitting alone in that fancy office of yours. For a moment, something in Pruitt's face wavered, and Naomi thought she glimpsed underneath the desperation a man who'd been drowning far longer than any of them had realized not just a villain, but a gambler who'd made one bad bet after another until the only move left was the one currently pointing a gun at a 16-year-old boy. Doesn't matter who, Pruitt said, catching himself some last shred of pride, refusing to hand over that final piece of the truth. Matters that I intend to walk away from this valley with enough to cover what I owe one way or the other. The pistol swung slightly from Tobias toward Caleb, and Naomi's whole body went cold. Grady! Caleb's voice was low, careful the same tone he'd have used gentling a spooked horse. You put that gun down right now, and this doesn't have to end worse than it already has. You've lost the ranch fight. Don't let it be the last fight you ever lose. Easy for you to say. You're the one walking away with everything. I'm the one who spent 2 years watching everything I inherited nearly slip through my fingers because a man I trusted decided my family's grief was an opportunity instead of a tragedy, Caleb said. And something in his voice had hardened past careful into something Naomi hadn't heard from him yet. Not anger exactly, but a kind of unshakable resolve. You made your choices, Grady. Every one of them. The forged rate, the fire, whatever you sent those riders here to do the other night. Nobody made you do any of it but you. You don't know the first thing about the choices a man makes when he's got nothing left, Pruitt said, and for just a moment his voice cracked something almost human breaking through the desperation. You think I wanted to be the villain in this? I built that bank from nothing. Watched my own father lose everything to men, just like the ones I owe now. I swore I'd never be caught the way he was caught. And here I am anyway. Then stop, Naomi said softer now. Some instinct telling her that reaching the frightened man buried under all that desperation might do more good than reasoning with the calculating one. Whatever's chasing you a gun in this yard doesn't outrun it. It only makes sure you're remembered as the man who pointed one at a child on top of everything else. Silas had circled wide during the exchange, moving with the slow, deliberate caution of a man who'd spent his whole life around dangerous animals and knew better than to make sudden movements around one now. Otis had done the same from the other direction, and Naomi realized with a jolt of fierce pride that the two of them were closing a slow circle around Pruitt without him even noticing, too consumed by his own unraveling to track more than the two people directly in front of him. Mr. Pruitt, Tobias said suddenly, his young voice shaking, but holding steady enough to carry. My pa always told me a man who points a gun at somebody he's got no real quarrel with is usually more scared than dangerous. That true? Pruitt's eyes flicked toward the boy, something almost like surprise breaking through the wild panic on his face. What? I said, is that true? Because you don't hardly seem like a man who wants to shoot anybody. You seem like a man who wants somebody to talk him out of it. It was Naomi realized exactly the right thing to say, delivered with exactly the right mixture of youthful courage and genuine curiosity, and in the half-second of confusion, it bought Silas moved. He closed the last of the distance in 2 long strides and grabbed Pruitt's gun arm, wrenching it upward as the pistol fired once into the dark sky, the sound cracking across the yard loud enough to send every horse within a mile screaming against their tethers. Otis was there a heartbeat later, and between the two of them, Pruitt went down hard into the dirt, the pistol skittering free across the ground where Caleb snatched it up before anyone else could reach it. Get off me! Pruitt shouted, thrashing against Silas's grip, all his careful polish gone. Now nothing left but a man on the ground in a fine suit, gone filthy, screaming at ranch hands who held him down without an ounce of mercy in their grip. "You have no right." "I've got every right," Silas said, his knee planted firm against Pruitt's back. "Same right any man's got to protect a boy from a gun pointed at his chest." Naomi realized she was shaking the adrenaline of the last several minutes, finally catching up to her all at once, and Caleb was beside her instantly, one arm coming around her shoulders, steadying her the way he'd steadied her down from the wagon on the very first day. "You're safe," he said quietly. "It's over. You're safe." "I know," Naomi managed, though her voice came out thinner than she intended. "I know. She looked past him at Tobias, who was staring down at his own hands, like he couldn't quite believe what they'd just helped accomplish. "Tobias, are you hurt?" "No, ma'am," the boy said, though his voice cracked slightly on the words. "Just scared out of about 10 years of my life. You did something very brave just now." "Didn't feel brave. Felt like I might be sick." "That's usually what brave feels like from the inside," Naomi said, and pulled the boy into a quick, fierce hug before he could protest, feeling him startle, and then after a moment relax into it, small and shaking and 16 years old, and entirely deserving of every ounce of comfort she had left to give. The sheriff arrived 20 minutes later with 2 deputies and half the town meeting, still trailing along behind on horseback, having apparently decided that whatever was happening at the Whitmore Ranch was too significant to wait for morning reports. He took one look at Pruitt, still pinned in the dirt, and cursing steadily under his breath, and one look at the pistol Caleb held out to him, and something in the sheriff's weathered face suggested he'd finally run out of patience for looking the other way. "Grady Pruitt," he said, hauling the man up by one arm. "You're under arrest for assault, attempted intimidation of a minor, and fraud, and I expect by morning we'll have added arson to that list once I've had a proper look at what's left of that hay shed." "You can't do this!" Pruitt spat, though the fight had visibly drained out of him, now replaced by something smaller and more frightened. The sound of a man finally understanding the full weight of consequences he'd spent years avoiding. "I have friends in this territory. Judges. Men who'll—" "Every friend you had walked out of that meeting hall tonight looking at you like something they'd scraped off their boot," the sheriff said. "I don't imagine there's a judge left in this county willing to spend his own reputation defending yours." He nodded to his deputies, who took Pruitt by both arms and marched him toward a waiting horse, still protesting, though his voice had gone thin and hollow. The sound of a man arguing with a verdict he already knew was final. The gray-haired woman from the meeting hall. Naomi would learn later her name was Mrs. Oletta Farrow, and that she'd buried 2 husbands and outlasted every scandal Miller's Bend had produced in 40 years, approached as the sheriff's party rode off with Pruitt in tow, surveying the scene in the yard with the same sharp, satisfied eyes she'd worn all evening. "Well," she said, "I believe that settles that." "I believe it does," Naomi said, still leaning slightly against Caleb. Exhaustion finally starting to outweigh the last of her fear. "Bank's going to need new leadership, of course. Board's not going to want to be associated with fraud and attempted murder any longer than they can help it. I'd wager they'll be looking to settle every irregular account fair and square, starting with yours, just to prove to the territory they're not all cut from the same cloth as Grady Pruitt." "You seem awfully certain of banking politics for a woman who spent the whole meeting sitting quietly in the front row," Caleb said. Mrs. Farrow's mouth curved into something that might have been the ghost of a younger woman's mischief. "My first husband was a banker, Mr. Whitmore. Learned more about how these institutions actually operate lying beside him at night than most men learn in a lifetime of doing the job themselves. You mark my words. This ranch will see its note settled fair within the month, and Grady Pruitt will spend considerably longer than that explaining himself to a judge." She was right, as it turned out, though it took closer to 3 weeks than 1 for the full weight of it to settle. The trial itself was held at the county seat in the same courthouse that sat behind Mr. Abernathy's recorder's office, and Naomi rode in with Caleb and Dunmore, both prepared to testify to everything she'd seen and heard since the night Pruitt first knocked on their door. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, close and warm, with the press of bodies come to watch a man who'd once held half the valley's debts finally answer for how he'd used that power. Naomi sat on a hard wooden bench beside Caleb, her hands folded in her lap, the same way they'd been folded on the train platform 2 months before, though everything about the woman holding them now felt different from the one who'd first arrived in Miller's Bend. When her turn came to testify, Naomi rose and walked to the front of the courtroom with her spine straight, the same posture that had carried her through every insult and every fire since she'd stepped off that train. And she told the judge everything plainly without embellishment, the way she told most things. "He came to our porch the very night of my wedding," she said, "and made it clear from the first breath out of his mouth that he intended to use the note against my husband's ranch to get land he wanted for himself. Everything after that. The rumors his wife spread, the fire, the men who rode up in the dark, the gun. He pointed at a 16-year-old boy in our own yard. All of it followed from that same intention. He never once tried to hide what he wanted, only how far he was willing to go to get it." The prosecutor asked her about the certified copy about Dunmore's ledger pages about the night of the standoff, and Naomi answered each question with the same steady clarity, refusing to let the weight of the room or the presence of Pruitt himself, sitting pale and diminished at the defendant's table, shake the calm she'd built for herself, one hard day at a time since that first morning on the platform. When the prosecutor finally asked whether she'd been frightened, standing in that yard with a gun pointed at people she loved, Naomi considered the question honestly before answering. "Terrified," she said, "but being frightened has never once stopped me from doing what needed doing. I learned that lesson a long time before I ever met Grady Pruitt, and I expect I'll go on needing it long after he's gone from this valley." A murmur ran through the courtroom at that, something that sounded almost like admiration, and Naomi caught sight of Mrs. Farrow in the gallery, nodding once, sharp and satisfied, exactly the way she had outside the meeting hall. Pruitt's own wife sat near the back of the courtroom throughout the proceedings, her face drawn and pale, and on the second day during a recess, she approached Naomi in the hallway outside, something hesitant and ashamed in the way she held herself. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "I owe you an apology. Everything I said about you in town, it was cruel and it was untrue, and I said it because my husband told me to, and because I was too frightened of him to ask why." Naomi studied the woman for a long moment, weighing the apology the way she weighed most things, testing it against the shape of the woman giving it. "I don't imagine it was an easy thing being married to a man like that," she said finally. "I hope whatever comes next for you is easier than what came before. That's kinder than I deserve, maybe, but cruelty never once made anything better in my experience, and I've had enough of it aimed at me to know I don't care to hand any more of it back out, even to someone who's earned a share of it." The trial concluded on the third day, the judge sentencing Pruitt to a term in the territorial prison for fraud, forgery, and attempted assault, along with a fine that stripped him of nearly everything he had left. The bank itself was placed under new management within the week, the board falling over itself to distance the institution from its former president's crimes, and the letter that arrived at the ranch not 10 days later confirmed in careful legal language that the Whitmore note had been restored to its original terms and would be considered current upon the next scheduled payment. Caleb read the letter twice at the kitchen table before setting it down, something in his face loosening in a way Naomi hadn't seen since the day of the fire. "It's done," he said quietly. "Actually done." A second letter arrived not long after this one from the railroad surveyor's office, confirming what Caleb had heard secondhand from a drunk surveyor months before the spur line was indeed coming through the valley and would very likely run along the eastern edge of Whitmore land within the next 2 years. "Funny thing," Caleb said, reading it over a second time. "Man tried to steal this ranch out from under me so he could sell parcels to a railroad that hadn't even confirmed its route yet. Might have lost everything for nothing, even if he'd gotten away with it clean." "Greed rarely does its own arithmetic honestly," Naomi said. "That's usually how men like Pruitt end up losing more than they ever stood to gain. It'll mean money eventually, real money once that line's finished. Then we'll decide what to do with it honestly when it comes. Same as we've decided everything else since I stepped off that train." Naomi folded the letter and set it aside, unwilling to let a stranger's railroad plans crowd out the quieter satisfaction of a debt finally settled fair, and a home Finally truly safe. It's done. Naomi agreed and reached across the table to take his hand, the same way she had the night he'd finally told her the truth about the note. Except this time, there was nothing left between them to confess. Nothing left hanging over the ranch, but ordinary summer work and ordinary summer heat. Dunmore, freed at last from the fear that had governed his life for 3 years, found work with an honest bank 2 towns over, and wrote Naomi a letter thanking her for a courage he swore he'd never have found without watching hers first. She kept the letter folded inside her Bible, tucked between pages she rarely turned to, otherwise a small, private reminder of how far one honest afternoon at a kitchen table could travel once it was allowed to. The town itself changed slowly, the way Naomi had learned. Most true things changed not in one dramatic sweep, but in small accumulated gestures that added up over days and weeks into something like belonging. The general store owner, who'd stood arms crossed and skeptical through the whole ordeal, began setting aside the best cuts of meat whenever Naomi came to town, claiming it was simply good business sense to keep a woman happy, who'd single-handedly increased his flour sales 3-fold. The blacksmith's apprentice started bringing his little sister along on delivery days, clearly hoping for another biscuit, and Naomi never once disappointed him. Even the preacher's wife, who'd worn that sour, unwelcoming face at the wedding a lifetime ago, stopped Naomi outside the general store one afternoon, her expression carefully, awkwardly softened. "I confess I judged you unfairly that first day," she said. "Watching you stand up in that meeting hall taught me something about the difference between a woman who looks like trouble and one who simply refuses to be quiet about the truth." "I've been called both in my time," Naomi said. "I've decided I don't much mind either, so long as the truth's the thing doing the talking." Even the whispers changed shape. Where once they'd carried cruelty about her size and her plainness, they now carried something closer to reverent gossip about the woman who'd taken down Grady Pruitt with nothing but a certified copy and an unshakable spine. Children in town had started a game, Tobias reported with no small amount of glee, where one of them played the corrupt banker, and the rest chased him down, shouting accusations of fraud. A piece of local folklore already taking root faster than Naomi could have imagined. 2 months earlier, standing alone and mocked on that same train platform, Naomi caught herself more than once almost missing the old unkindness simply because this new attention felt so unfamiliar, so entirely unlike anything she'd known before arriving in Miller's Bend. She mentioned as much to Caleb one evening, half embarrassed by the admission. "Feels strange is all," she said. "Spent 31 years learning how to carry insults without letting them show. Don't rightly know what to do with kindness instead. Keeps catching me off guard." "Give it time," Caleb said. "I expect you'll learn to carry that just as well. Might even come to like it better." "I expect I already do. Just took some getting used to." The hay shed was rebuilt within the month, the hands working alongside 2 neighboring ranches who'd sent men to help without being asked, a quiet act of gratitude for a woman whose cooking had fed half their crews at one point or another over the summer. Naomi marked the occasion with a supper so large that even Otis, whose appetite had become something of a local legend, admitted defeat halfway through the second pie. "Ma'am?" Silas said that evening, raising a glass of cider in a toast nobody had asked him to give, "I believe I owe you another apology on top of the first one." For what this time? Forever doubting even for a single minute on that first day that Caleb had made the smartest decision of his whole life, marrying you. He raised the glass higher. "To Mrs. Whitmore. May every fool who ever underestimated her live long enough to regret it." The table erupted into laughter and agreement, glasses raised all around. And Naomi felt something warm and unfamiliar rise in her chest. Not the careful, guarded pride she'd learned to carry through a lifetime of insults, but something looser. Something that let itself be seen without flinching. "You know," Otis said once the laughter had settled, "I've worked 5 ranches in my life, and I never once ate a meal on any of them worth remembering the next morning. I'll remember every single one you've cooked us, ma'am, long after I'm too old to work cattle at all." "That may be the finest compliment I've ever received," Naomi said, "and I've been complimented by a county judge this very week." "Judge's compliment probably came with less butter in it," Otis said, and the table laughed again, easy and warm, the kind of laughter that belonged to people who trusted each other enough to tease without fear of it landing wrong. Tobias, quieter than usual since the night in the yard, finally spoke up near the end of the meal. "Ma'am, you said before you might teach me some cooking if I was willing to learn. Did you mean that—" Every word. Even after. He hesitated, glancing down at his hands, the way he had that night, still visibly working through what he'd done and what it had cost him to do it. "Even after what happened. Silas says I did something brave, but mostly I just remember being scared." Naomi reached over and covered his hand with hers, the same steady gesture she'd used on Caleb the night he'd finally told her the truth. Bravery and fear aren't opposites, Tobias. They live in the same chest most days. What matters is which one you let speak first. You let the brave one speak that night, scared as you were underneath it. That's worth remembering, same as any biscuit recipe I'll ever teach you. The boy's face broke into something like his old easy grin, relief and pride mixed together in equal measure. "Then I reckon I'd like to start tomorrow if that suits you." "Tomorrow suits me fine." Later that night, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the dishes had been cleared, Caleb found her on the porch steps again, the same spot where they'd sat the night before the meeting, though everything about the world around them felt different now, lighter, settled in a way it hadn't been since she'd first stepped off that train. "Ranch is safe," he said, sitting down beside her. Notes settled fair. Pruitt sitting in a cell waiting on his sentence to run its course. "Whatever else comes, I don't think either one of us has to spend another night wondering if we'll wake up without a roof over our heads." "No," Naomi agreed. "I don't think we do." You ever think about what comes next now that the fighting's done, at least the kind of fighting that involves county records and forged ledgers? Naomi considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things, turning it over before she let herself answer. "I think I'd like to plant a proper garden come spring. Something bigger than what's out back now. And I think I'd like to keep teaching Tobias if he's willing to keep learning. Boy's got good hands. Could make a fine cook himself if somebody bothered to show him how. That's not quite what I meant. I know it isn't." She glanced over at him, feeling something quiet and certain settle into place between them, the kind of understanding that hadn't existed on that first wagon ride, but had built itself day by day, meal by meal, crisis by crisis, into something that felt now like it might actually last. "I think, Caleb Whitmore, that I'd like to stay. Not because there's a note to fight, or a fraud to expose, or anything left to prove to this town. Just because somewhere between that first supper and tonight, this stopped feeling like somebody else's ranch I happened to be cooking for, and started feeling like the first real home I've ever had." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone soft in a way Naomi hadn't heard from him yet, stripped of its usual careful restraint. "I built this ranch back up thinking I was fighting to save land," he said. "Took me a good while to understand I was actually fighting to keep you in it." Naomi felt her breath catch the old instinct to deflect a compliment rising up out of habit, before she pushed it back down, choosing instead to simply let the words land the way they were meant to, without armor, without the practiced ease of a woman used to protecting herself from disappointment. "That's a fine thing to say to a woman on a porch step," she said softly. "Wasn't trying to be fine about it, just trying to be honest. Same as always. You've made a habit of that. Honesty, I mean. Somewhere between the first letter and tonight I stopped bracing myself for the moment you'd turn out to be like every other man who ever wrote me a pretty word and meant nothing behind it." "I meant every word I ever wrote you," Caleb said. "And every word since. Figure I'll go on meaning them long as you're willing to keep hearing them." "I'm willing," Naomi said. "I find I'm more than willing." The summer night settled around them warm and quiet, the last of the season's heat still lingering in the air, even as the first hints of a cooler evening breeze moved through the yard. And somewhere out past the rebuilt shed, an owl called once into the dark, and neither of them moved to go inside. Caleb reached over in the dark and took her hand again, slower this time, less like a man steadying a woman who'd nearly been shot at, and more like a man simply wanting to hold on to something he'd decided somewhere in the last 2 months he had no intention of ever letting go of. "I've got something to ask you," he said. Been turning it over since the trial ended, and I don't much care for waiting on things once I've decided they're right. That's not like the man who took a full week to admit he'd married me partly to satisfy a bank," Naomi said, though there was no bite in it, only the easy teasing of someone who'd earned the right to tease. Wasn't proud of that man. Trying to be a different one these days. Took me long enough to learn the lesson, but I got there in the end, same as this whole valley eventually got there about you. He turned to face her fully, and even in the dim porch light, she could see something serious settling into his features. The kind of seriousness she'd only seen from him once before, standing in a yard with a pistol in his hand, and fear on his face. "We got married in 11 minutes, Naomi. In a church with a preacher's wife, looking like she'd bitten into something sour, and 2 hands leaning in the doorway placing bets on how quick you'd leave. Wasn't a wedding. Was a transaction dressed up in church clothes. I remember it well enough. I want to do it again. Proper this time. In front of the whole town, the ones who laughed at you on that platform, and the ones who've come to love your cooking since. And I want to stand up in front of every one of them and say the vows like I mean them, because I do mean them more than I meant anything I said that first week." Naomi felt something rise in her throat, thick and unfamiliar. The particular ache of being offered something she'd never once let herself imagine wanting. "You're asking me to marry you again. I'm asking you to let this town watch me choose you, properly. Not out of desperation over a banknote, not because I needed a household to satisfy some board's idea of stability, just because you're the finest thing that's ever walked into my life, and I'd like everyone in Miller's Bend to hear me say so out loud." That's a fine speech, Caleb Whitmore. Wasn't trying for fine, was trying for true. "Then yes," Naomi said, and felt the word land somewhere deep and warm inside her chest. Nothing at all like the careful guarded yes she'd given a preacher 2 months before. "Yes, I'll marry you again. Properly this time with the whole town watching, and I intend to wear something considerably nicer than the traveling dress I got laughed at in." Caleb laughed low and warm, and leaned in to kiss her, the first real kiss either of them had shared, slower and more certain than the formal handshake of an arm he'd offered outside the church that first day, and Naomi found herself leaning into it without a single trace of the careful bracing she'd carried through most of her adult life, letting herself simply be wanted without qualification, without apology, for the first time she could remember. Word of the second wedding spread through Miller's Bend faster than any of Pruitt's old gossip ever had, and this time the whispers carried nothing but warmth. Mrs. Farrow appointed herself something between a chaperone and a general, arriving at the ranch 3 days later, with bolts of fabric and an opinion about every single one of them. "This blue," she declared, holding a length of soft dove-gray silk against Naomi's shoulder, ignoring Naomi's protest entirely. "Brings out something in your eyes the brown traveling dress never could. And don't argue with me, girl. I buried 2 husbands, and I know precisely what a woman looks like when she's finally found a man worth dressing up for." "I wasn't going to argue about the color," Naomi said. "I was going to say it's far too fine a fabric for a ranch wife." "Nonsense. You took down the most powerful banker in 3 counties with nothing but a certified copy and a spine of iron. I'd say you've earned the right to a little fine silk." Mrs. Farrow's sharp eyes softened just slightly. "Besides, every woman in this town's going to be watching that wedding to see the dress on the woman who taught us all a lesson about judging a book by its cover. Might as well give them something worth remembering. You seem to have appointed yourself in charge of a great many decisions I haven't made yet. Somebody has to, dear. You've spent so long fighting bankers and forged ledgers, you've forgotten how to let anybody fuss over you for something as simple as a dress." Mrs. Farrow began pinning the fabric with brisk, sure motions, talking as much to herself as to Naomi. "I had precisely this argument with my second husband's sister 40 years ago, when she insisted plain gray was more suitable for a widow remarrying than anything with color in it. I told her plain-suited funerals, not weddings, and I wear this same dove gray to this day because I was right then and I'm right now." Naomi laughed despite herself, the sound easy and unguarded, in a way it had rarely been before this town, before this ranch, before this particular meddling old woman had decided to take her under a wing sharp enough to draw blood on anyone foolish enough to cross it. "Thank you," Naomi said, quieter now. "For all of this. You didn't have to take such an interest in a stranger's wedding. You stopped being a stranger the moment you stood up in that meeting hall with a certified copy in your hand and dared a room full of frightened men to look away. Mrs. Farrow's voice softened further, something almost maternal in it now. I lost a daughter of my own years back before she ever had the chance to grow into the kind of woman I suspect she might have become. Watching you fight for this ranch for that boy in the yard for your own worth in front of a town that didn't deserve you. At first I confess it did something for an old woman's heart she didn't know still needed doing. Neither of them said anything else about it, but Naomi reached out and squeezed the older woman's hand, and Mrs. Farrow squeezed back, and the moment passed between them, the way the truest moments often did without needing further words to hold their weight. Caleb, meanwhile, was having a considerably rockier time of his own preparations, judging by what Silas reported over supper 2 nights before the ceremony. Boss has been pacing the barn for the better part of an hour, Silas said, trying and failing to hide his grin. Kept asking Otis whether a man's allowed to be nervous about marrying a woman he's already married to once. And what did Otis tell him? Naomi asked, amused, despite herself. Told him any man who isn't a little nervous standing up in front of a full church to declare his feelings out loud probably doesn't have feelings worth declaring in the first place. Silas shook his head, still grinning. Then Caleb asked if his vows sounded foolish, and Otis made him say them out loud in the hayloft, and I happened to be passing underneath at the time. And, ma'am, I've heard grown men talk about cattle prices with less sincerity than that man talked about you. If half of what I heard makes it into that church on Saturday, I expect there won't be a dry eye left in the building, mine included. Naomi felt her own eyes go unexpectedly damp at that, and she busied herself with the stew, rather than let Silas see it, though from the softened look on his weathered face, she suspected he'd noticed anyway, and had the decency not to mention it. Tobias, meanwhile, had taken to the kitchen with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including himself, and by the second week of his lessons, Naomi had started letting him handle whole dishes on his own, standing back with her arms crossed, and her heart quietly proud, as he burned 2 batches of biscuits, before finally producing a third that made even Otis raise an eyebrow in approval. Not bad, boy, Otis said around a mouthful. Little dents in the middle, but not bad. High praise coming from you, Tobias said, grinning despite the criticism, clearly delighted simply to have made something worth commenting on at all. Give it another month, Naomi said, and you'll be feeding this whole ranch better than I ever did on my worst days. Don't know about that, ma'am. Don't think anybody's ever going to cook like you do. Everybody who's any good at anything started out burning biscuits, Tobias. Don't let anybody tell you different, including yourself. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and bright, the kind of summer day that seemed determined to prove something after weeks of fire and fear and hard-won victory. And Naomi stood in front of the small mirror in her bedroom, studying the woman looking back at her with something like wonder. You look like you're about to march into battle, Mrs. Farrow observed, adjusting the last pin in Naomi's hair with brisk, practiced hands. Which I suppose isn't far from the truth, given everything you've already survived to get here. I don't feel like I'm marching into anything, Naomi said. For the first time in longer than I can remember, I feel like I'm simply walking toward something I actually want. That's the whole secret, dear. Nobody ever tells you that marrying for love feels entirely different from marrying for necessity, even when it's the same man standing at the other end of the aisle. The church was packed tighter than Naomi had ever seen it, tighter even than the town meeting hall, the night Grady Pruitt's whole scheme had come crashing down in front of half the valley. Every hand from the ranch sat in the front pews, scrubbed clean and uncomfortable in their good shirts. Mr. Abernathy had ridden in from the county seat, claiming he wouldn't have missed it for anything, given how personally invested he'd become in the outcome of the Whitmore loan dispute. Even Dunmore had returned for the occasion, standing near the back with the quiet, grateful bearing of a man who'd finally found his own peace after years of carrying somebody else's guilt. When Naomi walked down the aisle this time, nobody whispered cruelly behind ironed bonnets. Instead, she caught snatches of conversation that would have seemed impossible 2 months before, a woman near the front murmuring to her neighbor about how fine the dress looked, an old rancher wiping something suspiciously close to a tear from his weathered face, children craning their necks for a better view of the woman who'd become something like local legend. Mrs. Farrow sat in the front pew, dabbing at her own eyes with a lace handkerchief and making absolutely no effort to hide it. And beside her, the preacher's wife, whose sour expression had greeted Naomi at the first ceremony, now watched with an open, unguarded warmth that Naomi found more moving than she expected. Caleb stood at the front of the church, looking nothing like the careful, guarded man who'd held out his arm like a business arrangement 2 months before. This time, watching her walk toward him, his whole face had opened up into something unguarded and plain. The same honesty that had drawn her to his letters in the first place, except now it was written across every line of his expression instead of hidden inside careful sentences. "You came back," he said quietly as she reached him, an old joke between them. Now the same words he might have said if she'd simply been running late. "Told you I didn't come this far to leave empty-handed," Naomi said, and felt the whole church laugh softly at the callback, warm and easy, nothing at all like the ceremony's first cold 11 minutes. The vows this time took considerably longer than 11 minutes. Both of them speaking words they'd written themselves, rather than the preacher's standard recitation. And when Caleb spoke his voice carried clear and unashamed to every corner of the packed church. "I answered your letter because it was honest," he said, "and I've spent every day since learning just how much bigger that honesty was than I ever gave it credit for being. You didn't just save this ranch, Naomi. You taught every person in this valley something about what it looks like when courage refuses to apologize for taking up space. I don't deserve the woman standing in front of me today, but I intend to spend the rest of my life trying to." A soft murmur of approval moved through the pews, and somewhere near the back, Naomi heard Otis blow his nose with considerably more force than the moment strictly required, drawing a ripple of quiet laughter that eased some of the tightness building in her own throat. Naomi felt tears she hadn't expected rising, and she let them come unashamed, the same way she'd learned to let so many things come without armor since that first supper 2 months before. "I spent 31 years believing the only thing I had to offer anybody was what my hands could make in a kitchen," she said, her own voice steady despite the tears. "You're the first man who ever wrote to me, like my words mattered more than my face, and you're the first man who ever looked at the woman those words described and decided she was worth keeping, plain speech and all. I don't intend to spend the rest of my life waiting for you to change your mind about that. I intend to spend it making sure you never once regret it." The preacher visibly moved himself despite decades of officiating weddings across the territory, cleared his throat twice before finally managing to pronounce them married for the second time, and this time Caleb kissed her properly in front of the whole town, and the church erupted into applause, loud enough to rattle the windows. The celebration that followed spilled out across the churchyard and down toward the town square tables, groaning under more food than even Naomi had ever produced in a single sitting. She'd spent 3 full days cooking, with help from half the ranch wives in the valley, all of whom had shown up unbidden, once word spread that Mrs. Whitmore intended to feed the entire town at her own second wedding. Fiddles came out. Children ran between the tables. Otis danced with an energy that seemed entirely at odds with his usual slow, deliberate movements, and Silas made a toast so long and so thoroughly embarrassing that Caleb finally had to physically remove the cider glass from his hand to get him to stop. "To the finest cook in 3 counties, Silas had managed to declare before Caleb intervened. "And to the boss who I always said was too stubborn to know a good thing when it stepped off a train, but who I'm proud to say finally figured it out before it was too late." "That's plenty, Silas," Caleb said, laughing despite himself as he pried the glass free. "I wasn't finished with the part about the biscuits." "You were absolutely finished." Otis, still catching his breath from an enthusiastic reel with one of the Farrow granddaughters, dropped into a chair beside Naomi with the satisfied groan of a man twice his age. "Ma'am, I don't believe I've danced like that since before my knees started arguing with the rest of me. Worth every ache tomorrow's going to bring." "You're a fine dancer, Otis. Don't let your knees convince you otherwise." "Fine dancer married to a fine stove," Otis said. "This ranch got lucky twice over the day you stepped off that train, whatever those fools on the platform thought at the time. I've said as much to anyone in town who'll still listen, and plenty who'd rather not. Tobias, meanwhile, had commandeered a corner of the dessert table and was explaining with the earnest pride of a boy who'd finally found something he was good at the finer points of pie crust to a cluster of younger children who seemed considerably more interested in eating the evidence than learning the technique. "You roll it thin," he was saying, "but not too thin or it tears clean through before you've even got it in the pan. Mrs. Whitmore taught me that. Took me 4 tries before I got one that didn't fall apart." "Bet it still don't taste as good as hers," one of the children said, through a mouthful of the very pie in question. "Give it another month," Tobias said, echoing words Naomi had said to him not 2 weeks before, and something in her chest warmed at hearing her own lesson passed down already. One small, unbroken thread stretching forward from her kitchen into a boy's whole future. It was well into the evening, the sun dropping low and golden over the valley, when a stranger's voice cut through the celebration, unfamiliar and oddly formal against the easy warmth of the crowd. "Naomi Hale, or Whitmore now, I suppose I should say." Naomi turned and felt something cold slide through the warmth of the evening at the sight of the man standing at the edge of the gathering well-dressed familiar, in a way that took her a moment to place, and when she did place him, something old and sharp twisted in her chest. "Mr. Ellison," she said. "I didn't expect to see you in Miller's Bend. Word travels even to Kansas City," Charles Ellison said, tipping his hat with the same careless confidence he'd carried the last time she'd seen him 4 years before, standing in her employer's parlor, explaining with excruciating politeness exactly why he'd decided not to pursue a courtship after seeing her in person for the first time. "Heard about a plain cook from my old boarding house taking down a corrupt banker clean across 3 counties. Couldn't quite believe it was the same woman I once knew." Caleb had gone very still beside her, some protective instinct clearly rising, but Naomi laid a hand on his arm, a silent request to let her handle this herself. "I imagine it's difficult to believe," Naomi said evenly, "given the last thing you told me was that a woman of my size and my plainness wasn't worth the trouble of courting, regardless of how well she cooked." Ellison had the grace at least to look slightly uncomfortable. "I was young, foolish perhaps. Watching what you've accomplished here, I confess I've had cause to reconsider certain judgments I made too quickly." "Have you?" "I came in part to offer my congratulations, and in part, I'll admit, hoping you might allow an old acquaintance a moment to apologize properly for how poorly I once treated you." The crowd around them had gone quiet, sensing the shift in the air, and Naomi felt every eye in the churchyard turned toward her the same way they had on the train platform 2 months before. Except this time she felt nothing like the fear that had gripped her then. "I accept your apology," Naomi said, and watched something like relief cross Ellison's face before she continued. "But I want you to understand something plainly, the same way I've learned to say most things plainly since arriving in this town. You didn't miss out on a chance with me because you were young or foolish. You missed out because you looked at a woman worth having and decided her appearance mattered more than everything else she had to offer. That's not youth, Mr. Ellison. That's a choice. And I'm grateful every single day that you made it, because it meant I was still unmarried and available to answer a letter from an honest rancher who valued my words before he ever laid eyes on my face." Caleb's hand found hers warm and steady, and Naomi felt the last of the old wound she hadn't realized she was still carrying finally close over, clean and complete. "I wish you well, Mr. Ellison," she said. "But I don't believe there's anything else you and I need to discuss." Ellison, to his credit, took the dismissal with something approaching grace, tipping his hat once more and retreating from the gathering without further protest. And the moment he was gone, the crowd's easy warmth returned conversation and fiddle music, picking back up as though the interruption had never happened at all. Mrs. Farrow appeared at Naomi's elbow almost the instant Ellison had disappeared into the dusk, her sharp eyes tracking his retreat with open disapproval. "That man had considerable nerve showing his face at your wedding of all occasions." "He came to apologize in his own fashion," Naomi said. "Apologies delivered 4 years too late in front of an entire town usually say more about a man's vanity than his conscience." Mrs. Farrow patted Naomi's arm briskly. "You handled him beautifully for whatever it's worth, from an old woman who's seen a great many men try that particular trick over the years. Come sniffing round once a woman's proven her worth, hoping to claim some part of the credit for having recognized it first. I don't imagine he'll try it with anyone else soon. I made certain of that. You certainly did. Mrs. Farrow's expression softened. I'll tell you something, dear, since I've buried 2 husbands and outlived most of my own foolish younger judgments. The women who matter in this life aren't the ones men choose easily. They're the ones men have the good sense to recognize before somebody wiser gets there first. Caleb Whitmore had that sense. Charles Ellison didn't. That's the whole of the difference, and no apology 4 years late is going to rewrite it. Mark an old woman's word on that, if nothing else I've told you tonight. You handled that better than I would have, Caleb said quietly, once the celebration had swallowed the moment back into its own noise, Mrs. Farrow having moved on to reorganize the dessert table to her exacting standards. I was about 3 seconds from telling that man exactly what I thought of him. I spent 4 years wondering what was wrong with me after he said what he said, Naomi admitted. Wondering if maybe he was right, if maybe a woman built the way I'm built simply wasn't meant for anything beyond a kitchen and a paycheck. Standing here tonight, married to a man who chose my words before he ever saw my face, surrounded by a whole town that's finally learned to see past what he never could I find. I don't need his apology nearly as much as I thought I might if this moment ever came. What do you need then? Naomi looked around the churchyard at Tobias laughing with a group of ranch children while attempting to explain his newfound biscuit expertise. At Silas and Otis arguing amiably over the last slice of pie. At Mrs. Farrow holding court near the fiddlers with the satisfied bearing of a woman who'd engineered at least half of the evening's happiness herself. At Dunmore, finally free of the fear that had haunted him for years, laughing easily with Mr. Abernathy near the punch table. This, she said simply. Just this. A town that finally sees me. A man who saw me from the very first letter. A home that's actually mine, built by my own 2 hands, out of nothing but stubbornness and good cooking, and a refusal to let anybody's cruelty decide what I was worth. The fiddle music swelled, and Caleb pulled her gently into the dancing clumsy and unpracticed in a way that made her laugh out loud for the first time in longer than she could remember. And around them, the whole town of Miller's Bend spun and laughed and celebrated a woman they'd once mocked without a second thought. Now standing at the center of their joy instead of the edge of their cruelty. Somewhere in the middle of the third dance, Caleb pulled her slightly closer, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear it over the fiddles. I've been thinking about something else too. Been meaning to ask, only there hasn't seemed a right moment, what with banks and fires and gunfights crowding out the quieter conversations. You've picked an interesting moment now in the middle of a dance you're not even doing correctly. Might be the only kind of moment a man like me ever gets around to picking. He missed a step, recovered, kept going. I've been thinking about children. About this ranch someday. Having somebody smaller than Tobias running around underfoot, learning the land the way I learned it from my own father. Wondered if that was something you wanted, or if I was getting ahead of myself asking on our wedding night. Naomi felt something warm and unguarded bloom in her chest, entirely different from the careful, protective warmth she'd learned to ration out over a lifetime of disappointment. I want that very much, she said. I want a whole house full of them if you're willing, all of them raised knowing their mother never once apologized for the space she took up in this world, and their father never once asked her to. Then I suppose that's settled too, same as everything else this summer. Same as everything else, Naomi agreed, and let him spin her badly into the next turn of the dance, laughing at his missteps and her own bad silk hem catching underfoot, feeling for the first time in her whole adult life, like laughter and love and hard-won victory could all live comfortably in the very same evening, without one ever needing to apologize for the other. Late that night, long after the last of the guests had ridden home and the ranch had settled into its familiar quiet, Naomi stood once more at her kitchen window, looking out at the darkened yard, where a hay shed had burned and been rebuilt, where a gun had once been pointed at a boy she loved, where a town's whole understanding of her had been rewritten, one honest meal and one hard truth at a time. Caleb came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin against the top of her head in a gesture that had become as natural between them now as breathing. "Regretting any of it?" he asked. "The wedding today, or the one that started it all?" "Not a single mile of it," Naomi said. "Not the laughter on that platform, not the fire, not Pruitt's gun, not even Charles Ellison showing up tonight, like a ghost from a life. I'm grateful I don't live anymore. Every hard thing that happened brought me exactly here, to exactly this kitchen, exactly this man, and I wouldn't trade a single piece of it for an easier road that never taught me what I was actually capable of surviving." "And what's that?" Naomi turned in his arms to face him, feeling the full weight of everything she'd carried since that first cruel whisper on the train platform finally settle into something she could hold without flinching. Not a burden anymore, but a foundation solid, and hers. She thought of the woman who'd stepped off that train 2 months ago, suitcase gripped white-knuckled spine straight against a town that had already decided her worth before she'd said a single word. That woman had survived on nothing but stubbornness and a refusal to cry where anyone could see it. The woman standing in this kitchen now had built something considerably sturdier than survival, and she intended to say so plainly the way she said most things that mattered. "That I was never the woman nobody wanted," she said, her voice steady and sure in the quiet of the kitchen that had first proven her worth. "I was the woman worth waiting for, worth fighting for, and worth finally fully being loved by, exactly as I am, without a single word of apology for taking up the space I was always meant to take." Caleb kissed her once more, slow and certain. And outside their window, the ranch that had nearly burned to nothing now stood whole and thriving under a sky full of summer stars, every field, every fence, every rebuilt beam of that hay shed, standing as quiet proof that the woman the whole town had once laughed at had built with her own 2 hands a home that could never again be taken from her. And that, in the end, was the truest thing Miller's Bend ever learned about Naomi Whitmore. Not that she had proven them wrong, though she certainly had, but that she had never once needed their permission to be exactly who she already was. Plain face, strong hands, unshaken spine and all.